This video is created with support from BetterHelp. Turbulence. That's probably the one word that strikes the most fear into the hearts of nervous flyers everywhere. But is it actually dangerous? And if so, in what way? Cabin crew always mention that it's important that you keep your seatbelt lightly fastened at all times, and today you'll find out where that instruction actually comes from. Stay tuned. The time is 01:10 Hawaiian Standard Time over the Pacific Ocean on the 6th of April 1993. A McDonnell Douglas MD-11 from China Eastern Airlines is cruising smoothly at 33,000 feet, heading eastbound towards the United States. The flight started in Beijing, and after an intermediate stop in Shanghai, it was now headed towards Los Angeles International Airport, and at the time of the accident, its position was about 950 nautical miles from Shemiya in Alaska. On board the aircraft, there were 235 passengers and 20 crew members, including 2 full flight crews of 8 pilots in total. The aircraft was about 5 hours into its flight from Shanghai, and the pilots who had flown the initial part of the flight had now gone back to the crew bunks to get some rest. This meant that the relief crew, consisting of a captain, first officer, flight engineer and a radio operator, was now in charge of the flight and had been so for the last 20 minutes preceding the incident. The flight had been perfectly nice and smooth up until this point, with no failures experienced and with nice weather forecasted ahead of them. The aircraft was cruising along above the clouds and at a manually selected speed of Mach 0.82, and at that altitude, that equated to about 298 knots of indicated airspeed. This was a normal cruise speed for the MD-11, but quite quick if you compare it to the Boeing 737 that I fly. We normally never exceed Mach 0.81 in any circumstances, but the MD-11 was a really quick bird, partially because of its high sweep angle of its wings, which enabled higher Mach numbers. The captain was 42 years old and had a total experience of 8,535 hours, of which 1,341 was flown on the relatively new MD-11. On this flight, he was training the first officer towards command and was therefore sitting in the right seat, whilst the first officer was sitting in the left. The first officer was 43 years old and very experienced, with 9,714 hours of total time, but only 199 of those had been flown on the MD-11. He had received his initial type rating on the MD about 5 months earlier, in December of 1992. The flight engineer was 41 years old and had similar experience as the first officer, and we don't really know the experience of the radio operator. The MD-11 that they were flying was a beautiful tri-engine aircraft built as a successor to the popular DC-10. It had received its FAA certification back in 1990, and it incorporated quite a few changes from the design of its predecessor. In the cockpit, it used 6 cathode ray tube displays instead of the old steam gauges, meaning that it had a full electronic flight instrument system, or EFIS, which effectively eliminated the need of the flight engineer. But this was still a relatively new system for China Eastern, which is likely why they were still operating with a 4-pilot cockpit crew. Another change in the MD-11 was that it had a slightly smaller overall tailplane than the DC-10 had, and it was designed this way to help reduce its drag and give better fuel economy. This reduction in size had been accomplished partially by reducing the amount of lift the horizontal stabilizer needed to produce in cruise by moving the center of gravity of the whole aircraft backwards with the help of fuel tanks situated inside of the horizontal stabilizer. Now, I know that this might sound a bit confusing, but it is a really important factor in this accident. So to explain it, let's look at some theory behind aircraft weight and balance, as well as some aerodynamics. An aircraft is kept stabilized and controllable in flight by balancing several different forces. If we concentrate on the pitch stability, you can try to picture the aircraft like a big teeter board. The point the aircraft is pitching around is called its center of gravity, which is the point where you can imagine that the whole mass of the aircraft is concentrated. If you imagine trying to balance the aircraft using one massive finger, that would be the point that you would need to use. But of course, if we didn't have some kind of stability added to the design, well, then a passenger moving inside of the aircraft would change the center of gravity and the aircraft would start pitching either up or down. Obviously, that's not what we want. We want the aircraft to be stable and controllable, even if the center of gravity moves around slightly, and this is where the horizontal stabilizer comes in. The horizontal stabilizer is built exactly like a small wing, but its lift is pointed downwards instead of up. Because of this, it's working opposite to the direction of the huge lift created by the wings. So, if you now go back to that picture of the aircraft acting like a teeterboard, start to picture the lift of the aircraft acting just behind the center of gravity with an upwards force. Now, if there was nothing to counteract it, this force would cause the aircraft to pitch forward, right? Exactly. And that's why the horizontal stabilizer is creating an opposite force, but a lot further away from the center of gravity, meaning that it has a longer moment arm to counteract that pitch and keep the aircraft level. This is how an aircraft keeps stabilized in pitch throughout the flight envelope, and we use the movable stabilizer to increase or decrease that downforce depending on how people are seated in the cabin or how the center of gravity moves throughout the flight as we burn fuel, for example. So moving the stabilizer will trim away any pitch tendencies that we pilots feel as we're controlling the aircraft, and that's why we refer to it as trimming the aircraft. So what does this have to do with the MD-11 then? Well, I'll tell you everything about that just after this. Very few things are as important today as awareness and support of your own mental health. Whether you're a nervous flyer who is struggling a bit with anxiety or a professional who just wants someone to talk to about your role, you should definitely check out today's sponsor, BetterHelp, the world's largest online therapy service. With BetterHelp, you can connect to over 30,000 licensed and experienced therapists who are specialized in supporting individuals just like you and me. They can provide you with help with, for example, fear of flying, but also with things like procrastination at work or just finding ways to improve your overall emotional well-being. Most people spend hours in the gym or on the treadmill every week, so why not give your mind the same kind of attention? BetterHelp services are completely online, allowing you to access them from the comfort of your own home and at a time that suits you. It's really therapy at your own terms. Getting started is super simple. You just answer a few questions about your needs and goals, and BetterHelp will then match you with the perfect therapist super fast. You'll then be able to contact him or her through text, chat, phone or video call, whatever makes you the most comfortable. And you can also change your therapist if you want to, everything to give you the best possible experience. So, if you are a nervous flyer or just want to keep up the maintenance of your mental health, then go to betterhelp.com/mentorpilot and receive 10% off your first month. Thank you, BetterHelp. Now let's continue. The problem with a downwards directed force from the stabilizer is that the bigger that force is, well, the more that downforce ultimately needs to be compensated by the upwards lift from the wings, and this creates drag, which means a higher fuel burn. But the engineers at McDonnell Douglas had figured out that if they could move the center of gravity further back in cruise by pumping fuel into tanks in the horizontal stabilizer, well, then they would need less downforce from the stabilizer and could therefore both save fuel directly and also make the whole tail a bit smaller, reducing the drag even further. Now, you might say, that sounds awesome, why doesn't everyone just do that? Well, it also comes with a couple of small downsides. Basically, an aircraft is a perfect combination of compromises everywhere, and this is no exception from that. If you move the center of gravity closer to the center of lift, the amount of downforce needed from the stabilizer will indeed be smaller, but so will the overall pitch stability of the aircraft. Stability is the aircraft's natural tendency to return back to a neutral state after a disturbance, and it's divided into dynamic stability, which has to do with the pilot's stick force, which should increase if the aircraft moves away from the trimmed airspeed, and static stability, which is what we're talking about here. The MD-11 had been constructed to fly in cruise with almost no static stability, meaning that a sudden flight control movement by the pilot could cause very abrupt pitch changes. This is actually how most modern fighter jets are constructed today. It makes them extremely maneuverable, but also very hard to manually control without some type of augmentation system or flight control support computer. The engineers at McDonnell Douglas knew this, so they had also created a longitudinal stability augmentation system called LSAS to help simulate this stability by basically acting like an always active autopilot altitude hold system. Now, LSAS could be overridden by the pilots by applying a manual stick force of around 2 pounds or just under 1 kilo, but it would resume immediately if the force on the stick would be released. It would then gently try to get the aircraft back to level flight by halving each subsequent pitch movement until it was fully level. Right, I understand that your heads might be spinning right now, but what all of this basically means is that the MD-11 was much less stable in pitch than other comparable aircraft at the time, making it harder for the pilots to control in case they needed to hand fly it while they were in cruise. Okay, so the next system that I need to talk about is the flap and slat system. In order for an aircraft to be able to fly well in both the high-speed and low-speed regime, we basically need to be able to change both the form and surface area of the wings. In high-speed flights, the wings needs to be as clean and uncurved as possible, but as we slow down during both the takeoff and landing, we need to increase its surface and curve it in order to generate as much lift as possible from the little speed that we have during those segments. We do this with the help of high lift devices, which are the flaps that extend at the back of the wings, and slats, which are devices extending from the wings' leading edges. Here we will focus on the slats. The slats, when extended, both effectively extends the wing's overall surface, but they also include slots, which lets part of the airflow through and up on top of the wing. The total effect of this is that it helps allow flight with a higher angle of attack, which is exactly what we need during the takeoff and landing. On the MD-11, each wing was equipped with 8 slats, grouped into 2 inner slats and 6 outer slats. When activated by the flap-slat handle in the cockpit, the 2 inner slats would hydraulically start extending first, and after about 3 seconds, the movement of the inner slats would then trigger an extension mechanism for the outer slats, which would then start extending. The outer 6 slats also had an auto-extend function, which would activate if the aircraft approached a low-speed stall with the slats retracted. Now, when it comes to the actual slat activation handle in the cockpit, it will become very important in this story. Because when the MD-11 was being certified, it was found that a breakage of the slat activation cable would default the slats to the retracted position, which was not ideal. The FAA wanted the system to instead default to a slat extension if the cable would break, and to achieve this, a combination of cable tension and spring forces was introduced to the system. Now, the issue with that was that the flap-slat handle now was under constant tension, so if the handle would, for some reason, move out of its up retract detent, it would quickly move to slat extension by itself. And this brings us back to this early morning over the Pacific Ocean. As the aircraft kept streaking across the sky, the 14 cabin crew members in the back had just finished the meal service and was now dampening the lights for the in-flight movie. The flight had been smooth up until this point, so the fasten seatbelt sign was not illuminated, and some passengers were moving around to stretch their legs or use the toilets. In the cockpit, several small failures had now started occurring in the number 2 flight management computer, which had caused the captain, who was sitting in the first officer's chair, to go into his CDU and reinsert some data that had gotten lost. This was a very minor nuisance, but it had likely alerted the captain a bit, and he now started looking closer at the information that he had in front of him. This is a quite typical pilot behavior. If one little computer bug appears, it seldom comes alone, so he was now actively searching for the next one, and a small circled speed on his primary flight display caught his attention. This speed was the FMC suggested economy speed, and it looked far too low in his opinion, so he again dove into his CDU to try to rectify that. Now, we don't know why the economy of speed was indicated lower than the captain expected. It's likely that someone has just entered a lower than normal cost index during the pre-flight sequence, which could have had this effect, but we will never really know. What is important here is that he was working with the CDU, and potentially in a bit awkward way, since this was not his normal seat and he would need to use his left rather than his right hand to do this. It is quite likely that during this work he accidentally bumped his hand or arm into the flap slat lever, just enough to move it out of its detent. And like I explained before, this was all that was needed for the flap lever to now move away from the up retracted position and initiate the slat extension. Now, this was far from the first time that this had happened. During the time from the MD-11 certification in 1990 and up to this accident, there had been 10 different instances of inadvertent slat extensions during various phases of flight. And because of that, McDonnell Douglas had implemented several service bulletins trying to deal with the problem, including installing a type of gate on the flap detent, but none of them had completely solved the issue. This had led to the airlines implementing training modules for their pilots in how to avoid these inadvertent slat extensions, and the captain had gone through that training just 1 month prior to this event. Anyway, like I said, as the flap slat lever moved out of its gate, the tensioned cable now started moving and initiated the mechanism for the extension of the inner slats. Both pilots were still likely looking at the CDU as this was happening, discussing how to sort out that strange economy speed. The first indication of something going wrong would have likely been a slight shuddering in the aircraft as the inboard slats now started extending into the airflow at a speed and Mach number much faster than they were designed for. Now, because the inboard slats are situated relatively close to the aircraft's center of lift, their extension didn't produce any significant change in pitch, but this was soon about to change. The aircraft had just entered into a pre-programmed slow right turn, and when the first 3 seconds had elapsed after the flap handle has been dislodged, the extent mechanism now also activated the outer slats. It's probably worth noting here that if the flap slat handle had been moved back into the retract position before those first 2 to 3 seconds, well, then the inboard slats would retract without the outboard slats starting to move. But after that time, the full extension of the slats was unavoidable and would go through the full extend and then retract cycle even if the handle was moved back again. As the buffeting now grew more intense, the captain looked down onto his primary flight display and saw, to his horror, a white downwards pointing arrow next to the slats indication and realized what was happening. He quickly moved the handle back into the retract position, but as he was doing so, the outboard slats were already extending. Now, remember how I said that the inboard slats didn't have any real impact on the pitch of the aircraft? Well, since the wings of the MD-11 was very steeply swept in order to enable flight with high Mach numbers, that meant that the outboard slats were positioned much more behind the center of gravity than the inboard slats were, and that meant that whatever lift effect they had would cause much more of a moment difference than the inner ones. Under normal circumstances, the slats being extended would cause an increase in lift and therefore a slight pitch down momentum. But in this case, the slats were being extended at a very high Mach number, which caused the air to move in a completely different way than in the low-speed regime. Basically, at higher Mach numbers, the air will not have time to properly adapt and float around the object that is moving towards it. This will mean that extending slats at the speed of Mach 0.82 will cause a loss of lift instead of a gain. And remember what we said about that teeterboard before? Yes, if the lift from the wings now suddenly decreased behind the center of gravity, but the downward force of the stabilizer remained the same, well, then the nose of the aircraft would start pitching up. And that's exactly what now happened. The autopilot was still engaged and started to input elevator to compensate for this pitch, but it wasn't quick enough to compensate completely in order to avoid it. This meant that the angle of attack, the angle of the oncoming air, now also started increasing rapidly, together with some G loading. You know, that feeling of being pushed into your seat? The margins to stall are quite small at these altitudes, and because the elevators of the MD-11 was built largely from composites, they were really sensitive to stall buffeting. So the stall warning system was set to activate quite early to avoid that. What this all meant was that as the aircraft now pitched up, the captain pushed the flap slat lever down and started observing the aircraft response, well, the stall warning now started sounding, together with a slat overspeed chime as the aircraft reached a maximum pitch of around 9.5 degrees pitch up. Now, pilots are trained to respond immediately to a stall warning, and the first thing that we're taught to do is to unload the wings by pitching down. And that's exactly what the captain now did. He started inputting on his yoke, pushing it forward, and by doing so, he also disconnected both the autopilot and the stability augmentation system. As he did so, the elevator input would have gone from a quite modest autopilot pitch down input into a significantly bigger pilot-induced one. This started to reverse the upward pitch and quite quickly instead turned it into a pitch down momentum. Now, anyone who's ever been in a roller coaster knows what happens when it shifts from a pull up in a valley and moves towards the next crest. You will go from being pushed into your seat to feeling like you're going to be pulled out of it instead. And what you are feeling there is the impact of positive and negative G-forces. Now, I'm going to hesitate to guess that most people who have ever tried a roller coaster would have been quite happy about their seat belts, and there's a very good reason for that. In the back of the cabin, this first upwards movement would have caused a positive G load of around 1.5 G, meaning a 50% increase in perceived weight. Now, that would not have been so bad, it would likely just have felt a bit strange. But what came next is what really started to cause this disaster. Because as the captain was now pitching forward, the positive G load quickly disappeared and now started to move into the negative direction instead, meaning that the passengers first started feeling weightlessness, but then as the G forces became negative, anyone who wasn't wearing their seatbelt was suddenly thrown up into the ceiling along with everything else in the cabin that wasn't tied down. As the aircraft started pitching more and more forward, the stall warning eventually disappeared. But a small detail about the stall warning system in the MD-11 was that it was programmed to last about 1 second longer than the actual stall condition necessitated. The thought behind that was to get the pilots to continue their recovery slightly longer and therefore avoid a potential secondary stall. But of course, in this case, it also meant that the pitch down effort was being kept just a bit longer than needed. The seatbelt sign was now activated, most likely by the first officer, but at this point it was already too late. As the aircraft was now pitching down and the stall warning had disappeared, the captain started to reverse the elevator input and pull the aircraft out of its dive. But he used much more elevator input than was actually needed, almost 7 degrees of pitch-up deflection. This meant that as the aircraft reached its lowest point of around -6 degrees, it now started pitching up again, causing another positive G load. That would have brought everything in the cabin who was previously pinned up into the ceiling crashing down again. The captain likely felt these positive Gs and responded by pushing forward slightly to smoothen things out. But remember, at this point, the aircraft would have had almost full ballast tanks in the stabilizer, meaning that it had close to neutral pitch stability, making pitch control really difficult. If he would have just let go of the controls at this point, the LSAS stability system would have likely intervened and stabilized the flight, but instead, the captain now saw that the pitch attitude that he wanted, which was around 2 degrees pitch up, was very close. This caused him to again pull slightly back on the controls to try and stabilize the pitch, but he pulled just a little bit too much, leading to another pitch up and another stall warning. This caused the whole situation to once again repeat, but this time with even bigger control inputs and pitch perturbations. The second pitch forward caused a negative G-force of -0.8 G, again throwing people, magazines, bags and trolleys up into the ceiling, before eventually throwing them back down again as the aircraft started pitching back up. This was then followed by a third cycle, every time becoming slightly more violent because of over-controlling and also the fact that the pilots were now trying to maintain manual control at the same time as they were also being subjected to these alternating G-forces, making it even harder. Since the stall warning kept going for that extra second, every time it activated, it meant that the corrections kept becoming larger, reaching a maximum of 24 degrees pitch down during the worst cycle, which also caused an altitude loss of around 5,000 feet. During that cycle, the maximum G-load experience was about plus 2.06 Gs and the minimum minus 1.24 Gs. After a number of perturbations, the control inputs finally began to decrease, leading to smaller and smaller cycles, and eventually the aircraft leveled off at around 28,000 feet after having accelerated to an airspeed of 364 knots, where an overspeed warning was also heard in the cockpit. 94 seconds after the inadvertent slat extension, the aircraft seemed to be finally under control and the pilot started climbing back towards 33,000 feet and engaged the autopilot again. Unfortunately, we have no idea about what kind of conversations were going on between the four pilots as this was unfolding, because the cockpit voice recorder was found to be faulty with no usable recording having been saved. The flight data recorder also had several issues with it, which meant that only partial data could eventually be retrieved. Now, some of you might be asking, how come that a trained flight crew was unable to handle a disturbance like this in a better way? Well, as it turns out, the crew were not trained in high-altitude upsets of this kind, nor in the handling of the aircraft with the stabilizer fuel tanks full. During these conditions, the MD-11 would have required significantly less pitch input than the pilots would have been used to, both from other aircraft types and how it would behave during a lower altitude flight. On top of that, the small pitch inputs needed would have been in stark contrast to the way an approach to stall and recovery maneuver would have been trained at the time. In the back of the cabin, it was now complete mayhem. The actual value of the G-forces had not been that exceedingly high, but the fact that they had moved between strong positive and negative Gs several times had caused several of the passengers to be thrown into the overhead bins, seat bags, armrests, as well as other passengers. When the pilots got into contact with the cabin crew, they were told about the severity of the situation, and that prompted the radio operator to, at the time 0123, contact the Honolulu air traffic controller and request an immediate diversion to the nearest available airport. About 2 minutes later, he called up again and clarified that the emergency had to do with a sick passenger. But then he further clarified that they had encountered severe turbulence and that there were multiple sick passengers on board. And he wasn't overstating that fact. In the back of the aircraft, the cabin crew members who weren't severely injured themselves were now dealing with a true nightmare. Out of the 255 passengers, only 97 were unharmed. 96 had minor injuries and 63 had serious injuries, mostly related to the head, neck and spine. The passengers most affected were those who had not been wearing their seatbelts when this sudden roller coaster started, or had been hit by other passengers or objects being thrown around in the cabin. As the cabin crew used up all of the first aid kits they had, the pilots were receiving radar vectors towards Shemia Air Force Base in Alaska. The problem was that this airport was still 2 agonizing hours away. As they progressed towards their new destination, the pilots started dumping fuel to prepare the aircraft for landing. This is something that larger, long-haul aircraft often must do if they need to divert along their route. The reason for that is that their maximum takeoff weight is significantly higher than their maximum landing weight. And to make sure that the aircraft can withstand the forces from a landing, the fuel is dumped to achieve a weight closer to or even under the maximum landing weight. The aircraft eventually executed an uneventful descent and ILS approach into runway 28 at Shemia Air Force Base, and at time 0329 they landed safely and started taxiing in. Waiting for them on the apron were several aircraft from the American Coast Guard and Navy who were ready to take the injured passengers to 4 different hospitals in the Anchorage area. Unfortunately though, 2 of the injured passengers ultimately passed away from their injuries. The investigation ultimately showed that even though the aircraft's cabin interior was severely damaged, the aircraft structure in itself was completely undamaged, and it was able to fly to a maintenance facility to undergo cabin repairs a while later. The cause of the accident was found to be inadequate design of the flap slat actuation handle, which had led to an involuntary slat extension at high altitude. This had in turn led to the captain trying to stabilize the flight and respond to the stall warnings, but due to the reduced pitch stability of the aircraft and a lack of training, his actions led to several large pilot-induced oscillations, causing the injuries in the cabin. This accident led to calls for a complete redesign of the flat slat handle on the MD-11, as well as changes to the cabin PAs, advising passengers to keep their seatbelts loosely fastened throughout the flight. All MD-11 pilots were also to receive more training on the handling characteristics of the MD-11 in cruise flight, as well as aircraft-specific upset and recovery training. There were also recommendations to establish a minimum stall margin of 1.3 Gs in the cruise phase for aircraft certified by the FAA, similar to the rules already in force in Europe at the time. As is the case with all accidents and incidents, this one has served to improve overall safety, not only for passengers on the MD-11, but for everyone else flying out there. As for nervous flyers, this will hopefully show that it's not turbulence in itself that we should worry about. The aircraft is more than able to handle that. Instead, turbulence injuries are more likely to be caused by simple things like not wearing your seatbelt or stowing your hand luggage improperly. If you are a nervous flyer and you feel like you need some professional support, then consider using today's sponsor, BetterHelp, by clicking on the link below and try it out. But if you instead feel like you only have some questions that you would like to ask, well, then you should check out my web at app.mentorpilot.com and ask my AI assistant Aidan your questions. You can also find aviation news, flight information, and much more, but the coolest features are there if you become a premium subscriber. Now, check out this or this video next, and if you want to support the work that we do here on the channel, then please join my awesome Patreon crew, or buy yourself a t-shirt. There are links here on the screen and in the description below. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. It has cooled down properly and you restart the engine, you will not have a problem. But as you know, on this particular occasion, since the pilots had forced the aircraft up to 41,000 feet and allowed the airspeed to come down that slow, it meant that the engines were operating at almost full power, heating them up greatly without getting much cooling air running through the core. So one of the engines was actually operated 300 degrees outside of its. This video has been brought to you together with Skillshare. Now you'll find a link in the video description below with a special deal just for you. It's late in the evening on the 14th of October 2004. An almost empty Bombardier CRJ-200 aircraft with only 2 pilots on board is finding itself in an extremely serious situation. During the climb out, several large pitch inputs have been felt, and right now the aircraft is at its maximum altitude in a fully developed stall on a left-hand bank with over 80 degrees, and both engines failed. But it's not the aircraft or the aircraft systems that have caused this situation. This is the shocking but unfortunately true story of Pinnacle Airlines Flight 3701. Stay tuned. The start of the story that led up to the crash of Pinnacle Flight 3701 actually started earlier during the day of the 14th of October 2004. The accident aircraft, which was a Bombardier CRJ-200, was due to fly from Little Rock over to Minneapolis with passengers on board. But as the flight crew lined the aircraft up on the runway in Little Rock and set takeoff thrust, they got an ACAS message. And the ACAS message had to do with the right-hand engine bleed air system. So the crew aborted the takeoff, they taxied back into the apron in Little Rock, and they called for some engineers. And the engineers were struggling initially to find the issues with the engines. They called in some more mechanics to help them. Meanwhile this was going on, the passengers was redirected onto a different flight, so took them over towards Minneapolis. So this meant that after a few hours, when the tiny little fault had been found and rectified, the aircraft was still sitting on the apron in Little Rock. But the airline needed that aircraft to fly the following day out from Minneapolis, so they now needed to get that aircraft over to Minneapolis. So they called in a standby crew. The crew that was called out to operate the flight consisted of a captain, was 31 years old, 6,900 hours of total time and 973 hours on the CRJ-200. He was happily married, family man, with mostly good training comments. Together with him was a 23-year-old first officer. He had been flying for Pinnacle for just over 6 months at a time. He had 761 hours of total time, 222 on the CRJ-200, and he was described as a really happy and positive person who was very happy with his position in Pinnacle. Both of the pilots were flown in as passive crew members on a flight from Detroit. They arrived at Little Rock about 20:36 in the evening, and they were both described to be in a good mood, well rested by people who met up with them on the ground. And according to the captain's wife, these two pilots had not flown together before. Before we go any further, I just want to point out a little bit about these type of positioning flights. So they are quite rare, obviously, because the airline doesn't like to fly around with empty aircraft. And because of that, there's always a bit of feeling of doing something special when you're operating a positioning flight. There's no cabin crew on board, there are no passengers on board, and because of that, you also as a pilot have to do some extra stuff, like you have to operate the air stairs if you have any. You have to make sure that the galleys are secure, that there are no trolleys moving around, and you need to arm the forward slides in case of an evacuation. There are very rarely any time pressures on a positioning flight. Like in this case, for example, the crew just needed to get the aircraft over towards Minneapolis to be used the following day. And because of that, it's likely that it was a quite good and kind of festive spirit to the operation. Other things that you also need to remember is that when you're operating an empty flight like this, the aircraft doesn't handle like it normally does. You are much lighter, so the performance is going to be different. It's going to be able to do things that it normally cannot do. Knowing this actually poses some quite significant threats, because the way that you operate an aircraft needs to be exactly the same no matter if you're operating with or without passengers or cabin crew. Okay, that's just to keep in mind. The crew received their briefing material, their flight plans. They were planned to climb up to a cruising altitude of 33,000 feet, and the weather along the route looked nice with only a partially covering cloud layer on the departure airport, but getting clearer as they moved northbound. At time 21:21, the CRJ-200 took off from Little Rock Airport, and almost immediately it was apparent that this aircraft was not being flown the way it was supposed to be. Because only 5 seconds after takeoff, at an altitude of about 450 feet, the first out of several very large pitch-up inputs came from the cockpit. The first one caused a lateral G loading of 1.8 Gs. It pitched the altitude up to 22 degrees nose up and caused a 3,000 feet per minute climb. This was then really quickly followed by a stick shaker event and then a stick pusher event, as in when the aircraft is pushing the nose forward. That was followed by full forward inputs on the yoke, which leveled the aircraft off and caused a lateral loading of about 0.6 G. Now, there was no indication of why this happened, because unfortunately there was no cockpit voice recorder data saved from this beginning of the flight. But from the flight data recorder, we know that this was the first out of 3 such inputs, which we'll get to in a second. The aircraft continued to climb, and at time 21:25, so about 4 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft reached about 14,000 feet climbing, the autopilot was engaged. And after that, both transcripts from air traffic control and flight data recording shows that the pilots now swapped seats. So this means that the captain moved from the left seat to the right seat, and the first officer moved over to the left seat. Why? We don't really know, but what we do know is that shortly after this, the autopilot was disconnected and a second pitch-up command was recorded from the cockpit. This time they pulled 2.3 Gs of vertical loading that gave a climb rate of about 10,000 feet per minute. The aircraft continues to climb, and just after this there is recordings of left and right cyclical movements of the rudder. So they started to the left, then right, then left, then right again. This gave some side loading to the aircraft, well within the performance limits of the aircraft, but definitely not something that you would have ever felt as a passenger, and not something that you would normally do. Anyway, the crew continues to climb, and at 24,600 feet, the last pitch up input is being felt. This time it's a 1.87 G loading, and that gives about 9,000 feet per minute in climb rate. This is indicative of pilots that are kind of testing things out. Right? They're doing stuff now that they would never do when they have passengers or cabin crew on board, kind of testing the limits of what the aircraft can do. The aircraft now continues to climb up to their planned cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. But somewhere around here, the flight crew decides that it would be a good idea to see if they can climb up to the maximum certified ceiling of the CRJ200, which is 41,000 feet. So they contact air traffic control, they request flight level 410, and the air traffic control sees that there's no traffic above them, so they clear them up to this level. Somewhere around here is also where the cockpit voice recorder transcripts start recording. So from here we know that the pilots were kind of giggling, right? They were in a festive mood in the cockpit. There are a lot of expressions like, oh man, oh bro, that's 41 it, I can't believe we're this high, it looks kind of normal though, and a lot of laughter and things like that. Definitely indicating that the mood in the cockpit is different than it would be on a normal commercial flight. The autopilot mode that the pilots are using to climb up to 41,000 feet is going to become really important to this story. They're using a mode called vertical speed. And what vertical speed does is kind of like the name implies, it maintains a certain climb rate, a certain vertical speed. This is a mode that we normally use very, very rarely when we are operating at high altitude, because it will climb with that vertical speed, and it will sacrifice speed in order to maintain that vertical climb rate. And this is exactly what happens. So from around 37,000 feet or so, the pilots input 500 feet per minute climb rate. Maintaining that climb rate is fine, providing that the thrust from the engines can sustain it, okay? Because the auto throttle will move the thrust to full thrust, and then it will maintain 500 feet per minute. And if the thrust is not enough, the speed will start decaying. And this is exactly what happened. They started with a speed of 203 knots, which is Mach 0.63, and as they kept climbing, the speed kept creeping lower and lower and lower. So as they reached 41,000 feet, the speed was now at 163 knots and Mach 0.57. Now, why is this important? Well, this turns out to actually be the most dangerous thing that they've done so far. Because if you know your aerodynamics, you know that as the speed keeps going slower and slower, if you want the aircraft to continue to fly, the angle of attack of the wing, as in the angle that the wing is having against the oncoming air, needs to increase. You need to have more and more angle of attack in order to create the same kind of lift with lower speeds. However, when you do that, the pressure difference between the lower part of the wing and the upper part of the wing will increase, and that will increase those vortexes that are being created at the wingtips. Now, those vortexes also comes with something called induced drag. So what this effectively means is that as the aircraft keeps going slower and slower, especially at high altitude where the air is really thin, this induced drag will become bigger and bigger, and the aircraft might end up in a situation which we pilots refer to as being at the back of the drag curve. Essentially, that means that as the aircraft goes slower, the drag will increase, so it will go even slower, and it will go slower and slower. And unless you have enough engine thrust to pull yourself out, to accelerate the aircraft, to reduce that drag, well, the aircraft will eventually stall, right? It will not return to this speed by itself. And another issue you have when you're up at these altitudes is that the air is so thin that the engine thrust is greatly reduced, right? The engines will not be as effective up there. So we are really, really careful when we operate at higher altitudes because of this, right? This is something that we are constantly looking out for when we are climbing, and that's why vertical speed is a mode that can be very dangerous. And in fact, this is probably the most dangerous things that they've done up until this point, even though all of the other things that they've done is much more spectacular. The pilots of this flight doesn't seem to recognize this issue. Instead, they are really amped about having joined the 41K club. They are discussing this forth and back and how cool it is, and they're also at this point being changed over from one air traffic controller over to the other. The new air traffic controller asks them what aircraft type they're flying. And when they respond that they're flying a CRJ-200, the air traffic controller basically responds, "Oh, I've never seen you guys up that high before." And the captain responds to that with, "Well, we don't have any passengers on board, so we decided to have a bit of fun and come up here. And this is actually our service ceiling." So that kind of highlights that there was no operational reason for the crew to climb up to 41,000 feet. The only reason they did so was because they wanted to try something out, to join the 41K club. The captain asks the first officer if he wants something to drink. The first officer makes some jokes about checking if the liquor cabinet is locked, but then he asks for a Pepsi. The captain goes to prepare the Pepsi for the first officer. When he comes back, it seems like he's starting to realize that this is not a good position they're in, because he says, we're losing here. We're gonna come down in seconds, and this thing ain't gonna hold the altitude, is it? And the first officer responds with, "It can't, man. We kind of greased it up here, but it won't stay." What this indicates is exactly what we were talking about before. They're now so far back on the drag curve that even though the thrust is set to maintain the speed and the altitude, the speed just keeps decelerating, and this is what they're seeing on the speed tape. At 21:54, the captain contacts air traffic control and asks them to get a lower altitude, maybe flight level 390 or 370. But only seconds after he calls, the first stick shaker event happens as the aircraft reaches 150 knots of indicated airspeed. This is then followed by 4 other stick shaker events and 4 stick pusher events. For each of these, every time that the stick pusher is activated, the nose is pushed down in order to gain airspeed, but almost immediately after that, the nose is then being pulled up again to maintain the altitude. This has as a consequence that the speed just keeps going lower and lower and lower, and the attitude of the aircraft, angle of attack, is getting higher and higher. And the highest indicated attitude was 29 degrees nose up at 41,000 feet. When that happened, on the 5th stick shaker and 4th stick pusher, the aircraft goes into an aerodynamic stall. As that happens, both engines 1 and engine 2 flame out almost simultaneously, and the aircraft goes into a bank with the left wing low. It banks as much as 82 degrees left and pitches down with 32 degrees nose down. In the following 14 seconds, the pilots are inputting on the controls and manages to get the aircraft under control, but they're losing 7,000 feet in the process. During the recovery procedure, the captain had time to call air traffic control. He said, "We're declaring an emergency, stand by," and then he's focusing on the first officer's actions in the left-hand seat. Air traffic control comes back and gives them a clearance to descend 24,000 feet, which the captain acknowledges. As this is happening, the ADG, the air-driven generator, which is similar to a RAT, a ram air turbine on Airbus, is being deployed into the airstream. We can hear that on the cockpit voice recorders because it makes quite a lot of noise in the air. And about 20 seconds after the initial stall, someone in the cockpit calls out, we don't have any engines, and the captain responds with dual engine failure. This is then quickly followed by the captain starting to action the dual engine failure checklist, which has some memory items in it. One of those memory items is to make sure that the airspeed of the aircraft doesn't go below 240 knots.
Now, that's not very clearly written in the checklist. It just says airspeed 240 knots. It doesn't clearly specify that that's the minimum. And this is going to be one of the changes that will come out of this accident eventually. Because as they're descending now, they're not maintaining 240 knots. They're maintaining a lower speed than that, between 170 and 200 knots indicated. The dual engine failure checklist tells the crew to, if they're between 21,000 feet and 13,000 feet, to consider a windmill start. And the beginning of that checklist is that you need to maintain 240 knots, stabilize yourself there, and when you're ready to try to windmill start the engines, as in using the airflow from the speed of the aircraft to turn the engine components in order to start them, you need to pitch the aircraft forward in order to achieve an airspeed of at least 300 knots indicated. So the captain is reading this out and he's telling the first officer to pitch forward, all right? Give me 300 knots, pitch forward more. The first officer does so, right? He pitches the aircraft forward with about 5 degrees nose down, but every time that he does so, he continues to pitch the aircraft up again. So the highest speed that the aircraft reaches throughout this maneuver is 236 knots, which is lower than the minimum 240 needed. And you will understand why this is so important later on in this video. Now, as the captain is dealing with the dual engine checklist, the cabin altitude alert goes off. Because the way that the pressurization system is built in modern airliners is that it uses bleed air from the engines to pressurize the aircraft. And of course, if you've lost both engines, it means that there is no bleed air available now to pressurize the cabin. So as they're dealing with the checklist now descending, the cabin altitude has been steadily increasing until they're now in a position where they need to put the masks on. There's a little bit of ambiguity in the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder about when they actually put the masks on, but they did put the masks on during this time. With all of this going on, the captain continues to insist that the first officer lowers the nose to get the speed up, but it doesn't really happen and the captain doesn't push for it any further than that. The aircraft is now descending through about 29,200 feet, and up until this point, the electrical power has been supplied by the air-driven generator, the AGG. But at this point, and following the dual engine failure checklist, the captain decides to switch on the auxiliary power unit, the APU. And that's important because the APU will be able to provide full electrical power to the aircraft, and also, crucially, it will be able to provide pneumatic power in case the windmilling start is unsuccessful and they need to do an APU-assisted restart attempt later on. I also want to point out at this point that the aircraft is almost at 30,000 feet, and even if they don't have two engines, at 30,000 feet they have a quite good gliding distance. Okay, they have a large area around them which they could reach given the speed and the altitude they have, and within the gliding distance they have about 6 airports at this point. Now, this serves as a good reminder that if you ever find yourself in a situation like this, if you're a pilot, dividing the roles in the cockpit is really important. The pilot flying in a situation like this has to assume the worst, namely, we have lost both engines, we might not be able to restart them, so what is my plan going to be? And communicate with air traffic control, point towards an airport that is within your obvious gliding distance, probably keep yourself a little bit high, and just aim for that. Start preparing plates, start briefing yourself quietly in order to be able to get into one of these airports. The pilot monitoring on the other side needs to focus on running through the checklist accurately, trying to get this, at least one of the engines started, because if they manage to start one engine, they will have a lot more options and a lot more time available. But in this case, this crew seems to be fully focused on just trying to start up the engines, right? The first officer is maintaining a largely northerly, northeasterly heading, and there's no discussions going on about which airports to go to, nor are they talking to air traffic control and giving them any kind of indications on how severe this problem is. But at this point, air traffic control actually calls the aircraft up and asks them what their status is, what kind of failure and emergency they're actually declaring. Because remember, up until this point, they've only declared an emergency, and they've also told air traffic control to stand by, which means that air traffic control is going to assume that they're really busy and they're working on the checklist and are unlikely to come in and potentially interrupt them. But here air traffic control thinks that the timing it's been too long, they need to know a little bit more about what's going on. So they ask them, and the captain comes back, and what the captain says is that, well, we've had an engine failure up here, and we're now trying to descend to restart the other engine. This is not true, all right? Yes, they have had an engine failure, but they've also had a second engine failure. And the difference between an aircraft that is flying on one engine, wanting to restart the other, and an aircraft flying without any engine is huge. One is an immediate emergency, the other one is a well under control situation. So the controller comes back and said, understand, controlled flight on one engine, and there's no response back from the captain to that question. As the aircraft continues to descend now, the captain tries to restart the engines using the APU. He does 4 separate restart attempts, 2 on each engine, all of them unsuccessful. The N2 rotation is stuck at 0. It does not move whatsoever. And as they're now getting closer to 13,000 feet, they ask for further descent from air traffic control. Air traffic control comes in and asks them, do you need to land? And the captain just responds that, no, we're still trying to restart this engine. So at this point, as low as 13,000 feet, air traffic control still does not know that they're dealing with an aircraft that doesn't have any engines. And the captain still seems like he's trying to obscure the fact that they have put themselves in this situation. At time 22:08, the captain is heard on the cockpit voice recorder saying, switch. The first officer responds with, yeah. And then there is some reshuffling sounds on the cockpit voice recorder indicating that the pilots are now switching back to their original seat. So the captain goes into the left seat again, the first officer into the right seat, and from this point onwards, the captain is in control of the aircraft, and the first officer is handling checklist and talking to air traffic control. And when the first officer calls up air traffic control, the first thing he does is to declare that they're actually having a dual engine failure and that they need vectors towards the closest airport immediately. As the aircraft is passing about 9,000 feet now, with air traffic control well aware about what's going on, the crew is asking for help to get towards the closest available airport, and that is identified as Jefferson City, which is just straight ahead. The problem is, though, that even though Jefferson was within gliding range when they were at 30,000 feet and when they were at 20,000 feet, since they've been maneuvering, since they've been trying to restart the engines and haven't focused on maintaining the best gliding speed, which would have been 170 knots, Jefferson City is now outside of the gliding range, but they haven't really found that out yet. They haven't noticed that yet. Instead, the first officer is asking air traffic control to get the frequency for the tower of Jefferson City, also for the ILS frequency, so that they can tune that. And at this point, they're still in cloud, okay? The cloud layer overhead Jefferson City is about 5,000 feet. So they're continuing to descend now. The captain is asking for vectors to turn to establish themselves on the center line, which they eventually do. But when they break out of clouds at about 5,000 feet, then the captain asks where the runway is. The first officer sees the runway, points it out to the captain, and the captain states, we're not going to make this runway. And is there a road or something? They look around themselves, they see a straight line of lit highway a little bit to the left, so the aircraft departs from the runway center line in Jefferson City and turns towards this highway. At time 22:14:46, the captain is heard on the cockpit voice recorder saying, let's keep the gear up, I don't want to go into any houses here. Now that shows some significance to me, because as a pilot, I know that if you are to make an emergency landing on solid ground, getting the gear out is crucial in order for the gear to absorb some of the impact forces. And the fact that they choose not to do that, to extend their glide, to try to avoid houses, shows that the captain is now focused on trying to avoid casualties on the ground. The last thing that is heard on the cockpit voice recorder is, we're going to go into houses. And then there are several ground proximity warning system alerts, followed by the impact noises at 22:15:06. The aircraft clips a few trees and a garage before it impacts the ground inside of a populated area. It flips over and bursts into flames as it lands. Both pilots are lost in the impact, but fortunately there are no injuries to any persons on the ground. The aircraft investigation team was very quickly on site at Jefferson City, and they started to try to gather up data and information about what could have caused this. And very quickly they could find the undamaged cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. And from that, they were able to build a pretty clear picture of what had been going on. Obviously, the main focus was on the way that the pilots had acted up until they stalled at 41,000 feet. But there were a few questions that needed to be answered. One, why did the pilot flying, the first officer in this case, act the way he did when he was confronted with the stall warnings? Number two, why did the aircraft's engines flame out as the aircraft stalled, and why were they not able to get the engines running again? Now, we're going to get into the technical aspects of this just after this message from my sponsor. I also want to take a few seconds here to say a special thank you to the sponsor of this episode, which is Skillshare. Now, I know that you are watching this because you are a curious person, a lifelong learner, someone who constantly wants to improve and understand the world around you better. And in that case, Skillshare is definitely something that you should be checking out. Okay? They have thousands of high-quality video courses and pretty much anything that you can imagine. A course that I'm using myself at the moment is 5 Minutes Creativity with Jasmine Cheyenne, where she gives kind of hands-on tips on how to chisel out a few minutes to be creative every single day, and it's something that I personally really need. But there are also courses in, storytelling, creative photography, or even how to use your own home simulator to improve and prepare before you start your private pilot license. So if you think, Peter, that sounds amazing, well then the 1,001st of you guys who clicks on this link here below will get 1 month of premium Skillshare absolutely for free. So click the link and start exploring your curiosity today. To answer the first question about why the first officer acted the way he did when confronted with the stall warnings, they had to go back to the training organization at Pinnacle Airlines. And it was very clear from the training organization that the way that the crews were being trained to handle impending stalls was to avoid getting into a fully developed stall. So to use the stick shaker or the onset of vibrations as a first indication of stall, and to act accordingly, to try to get the aircraft out of stall, increase the speed, decrease the angle of attack as soon as possible. But what also became clear to the investigation team was that this type of training was very rarely done at high altitudes. It tended to be done at around 10,000 feet in different configurations, and a lot of the emphasis on these type of training was to try to both rectify the stall situation, getting the airspeed up and getting the angle of attack down, but also to minimize altitude loss. And this was common in the entire industry at the time of the accident, that it was kind of thought that stalls would mainly happen as the aircraft was part of the approach traffic circuit, and therefore terrain would be a major issue. So once the immediate stall threat was solved, well then altitude loss needed to be minimized. And also at around 10,000 feet and below, the engines are very powerful. The engines have the possibility to almost pull an aircraft out of a stall. That's not what happens at 41,000 feet, where the engines have very little excess thrust available. So as a consequence of this accident, airlines all over the world started to practice more high altitude stalls and to emphasize on the importance of really getting the nose down and keeping the nose down until the speed has recovered, using the engines nice and slowly and smoothly to get the speed up, and only once the speed is back up and the aircraft is unstalled can you start thinking about regaining altitude, not before that. Now this brings us then to the issues with the engines. And when it comes to why the engines actually flamed out, that was fairly easy to figure out, because the aircraft was in such an extreme position at 41,000 feet with a pitch attitude of 29 degrees and a really, really low speed. What actually happened was that the airflow going into the engine was severely disrupted. This led to compressor stalls and basically not enough air being pumped into the combustors in order to sustain the flames. So the flame out of both of these engines came from the extreme attitudes that the aircraft found itself in during the upset. But this still doesn't explain why the engines wouldn't restart, right? It's one thing if they flame out, but if you're at 41,000 feet, you should have ample time to both try to windmill restart the engines and then later on use the APU to start it. But in this case, no matter what the flight crew was doing, the N2, the high pressure compressor and turbine just would not move, right? N2 was stuck at 0, and no matter what they did, it wouldn't turn. Why is this? Well, when the NTSB asked the engine manufacturers, they found out that these particular engines, the CF34-1 and 3 engines, had issues with the in-flight engine starting procedure during certification testing. Namely that if the engine core was allowed to wind down to 0, it could face something called a core lock. And what a core lock basically is that it has to do with an air seal inside of the high pressure turbine. Now this air seal, it directs airflow and cooling inside of the engine. And because it does that, it has to be really, really tight. And the way it's constructed is it has a rotating part and a static part. Now the rotating part has some teeth in it that grinds little grooves in the softer static part around it. And generally during normal engine operation, the margins are really, really tight. Now what can happen if the engine is running at a really high temperature and then suddenly gets cooled down is that the softer surrounding static material will cool down quicker than the rotating part of the air seal. And when that happens, the rotating part can move outside of those grooves that it has been grinding and into new material in the soft material. And at the same time, the softer material, since it's cooling down quicker, is contracting around the rotating part, greatly increasing the friction inside of the engine. If the N2 rotations, the high pressure part inside of the engine, is allowed to come to a complete stop, this can actually lock the engine up until the internal components have cooled enough for them to release from each other. And this is why, remember how I said earlier in the video that it was so important that the airspeed was kept at a minimum of 240 knots? Well, that's because at 240 knots, there's enough air running through the core of the engine to keep this air seal rotating while it's being cooled down. Then, as it has cooled down properly and you restart the engine, you will not have a problem. But as you know, on this particular occasion, since the pilots had forced the aircraft up to 41,000 feet and allowed the airspeed to come down that slow, it meant that the engines were operating at almost full power, heating them up greatly without getting much cooling air running through the core. So one of the engines was actually operated 300 degrees outside of its red line maximum temperature. The other one was just below the red line. And when the pilots finally got the aircraft into that upset where they were at 29 degrees and the aircraft stalled, well then the engines would have been red hot and then suddenly flamed out, cooling down really quickly since they're at the really cold temperatures that we have at 41,000 feet. Then the aircraft was descending down at a lower speed, allowing this core lock to occur. And this is what happened. These engines were completely locked up. It didn't matter what the pilots did after that point. they wouldn't start rotating. The only thing that would have allowed them to start rotating was more time to let the internal components cool down sufficiently so that they release from each other, and then they would have been able to restart the engines. Now, because of this, there was an airworthiness directive sent out to all of the users of the CF34 engines to let them know about this potential for core locks in certain situations. And there was also mandates from the FAA to General Electric to try to update the way that these air seals were constructed to minimize the risk for core locks like this to happen in the future. So this just brings us to the end of the final report and what the NTSB deemed to be the probable cause of the accident. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable causes of this accident were 1. The pilot's unprofessional behavior, deviation from standard operating procedures, and poor airmanship, which resulted in an in-flight emergency from which they were unable to recover, in part because of the pilot's inadequate training. 2. The pilot's failure to prepare for an emergency landing in a timely manner, including communicating with air traffic controllers immediately after the emergency about the loss of both engines and the availability of landing sites. And 3. The pilot's improper management of the double engine failure checklist, which allowed the engine cores to stop rotating, resulting in the core lock engine condition. Contributing to this accident were 1. The core lock engine condition, which prevented at least one engine from being restarted, and 2. The airplane's flight manuals that did not communicate to pilots the importance of maintaining a minimum airspeed to keep the engine cores rotating. I know that this video might stir up some feelings in you, feelings like anger, disappointment, shock, and awe. That's not the reason I chose to make this video. I chose to make this video because it highlights a really important point, which is how important it is to stay professional no matter what kind of situation you find yourself in. Even if you are in a position where no one will ever find out how you were operating or what you were doing, it still might have impact, it still might have consequences. So try to stay as professional as possible. Also, there are some really important learning points in this video regarding high altitude operations, aerodynamics, and also some technical systems. And this is always why I make these videos, right? Every one of these videos in my series about aviation accidents and incidents, which you can see more of up here, I will try to highlight something that is really important, something that made the aviation world a bit safer after the accident, even though it might have been really, really tragic when it happened. And I hope that you find these videos interesting and that they teach you something, even if you're not in the aviation industry. And if you do, then please share these videos on social media, but also make sure that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the notification bell so that you know whenever I send out new videos. I hope that I get to hear from you inside of the Mentor Aviation app or inside of my Discord server. If you want to buy one of these t-shirts that I'm wearing, well, then I have several of them available in my Teespring store. There are links here below the video or in the video description as well, and everything of the proceeds that comes from you buying these t-shirts will go to the channel and to my work with increasing the quality. And if you want to be part of the real core team, the people that really have influence on what happens on the channel, suggestions, feedback on my videos, well then join my Patreon crew. I have weekly hangouts with my Patreon crew where we discuss what's going on in the world and in their lives and also what's happening on the channel, and they have the chance to discuss feedback about videos and stuff with me. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. This video is brought to you together with Skillshare. Use the link in the description below for a special deal just for you. It's evening on the 24th of June 1982. The sun has just set and darkness has fallen upon the Boeing 747-200 from British Airways, which is cruising along at 37,000 feet over the eastern Indian Ocean. The flight crew has settled back into their seats after a nice meal when they suddenly start seeing the most incredible display of St. Elmo's fire over their windscreens. As they're looking out over their wings, they can also see that the same type of glow is engulfing the entire aircraft and also coming out of their engines. It is incredibly beautiful, but also, as it turns out, incredibly dangerous, because as the pilots are trying to figure out what it is they're seeing, the first engine flames out. What happens after this is an absolutely incredible story, and it is the story of British Airways Flight 009. Stay tuned. British Airways Flight 9 was the third leg on a flight that had originated in London in the United Kingdom, and then the aircraft had proceeded via Bombay to Kuala Lumpur, where this flight starts, and it was supposed to continue via Perth, then to Melbourne, and then finally inbound to Auckland, New Zealand. The aircraft being used was a 3-year-old Boeing 747-200 equipped with 4 Rolls-Royce RB211 jet engines. On board the aircraft, as it departed from Kuala Lumpur, was 247 passengers and 15 crew members. And most of those passengers had actually been on board from the very beginning in London, but the flight crew had boarded in Kuala Lumpur to fly the leg over to Perth in Australia. In the cockpit was a relatively young but still very experienced flight crew consisting of 41-year-old Captain Eric Moody. Together with him was 32-year-old Senior First Officer Roger Greaves and 40-year-old Senior Flight Engineer Barry Townley Freeman. Captain Eric Moody had started his career way before as a glider pilot, and that's going to actually turn out to be quite important during this incident. During the pre-flight preparation, when the pilots got their briefing material together and they started looking at how the flight was going to progress, it looked like the weather was going to be quite nice. There was only some light clouds, but generally no turbulence forecasted and no adverse weather in the briefing. And it looked like the flight was going to take about 5 hours over towards Perth.
And we went to the airport, and the airplane was a little later coming in. So instead of rolling down the runway at 7, I think it was 7:30 before we took off. There was nothing abnormal about the night. It looked like a lovely, pleasant night's ride down to Perth. It was about 5 hours flight time. So it was my sector, and eventually we trundled down the runway. Oh, I made a point to say it was half an hour later than it should have been. Well, that had a great significance on what happened to us later on.
Captain Eric Moody decided that he was going to be pilot flying for the first leg, so the crew went out to their aircraft, they boarded the passengers, taxied out, took off normally, and then started climbing down south over the Indian Ocean. The first part of the flight was very nice and routine. The crew was cleared up to their cruising level of 37,000 feet. Once they had achieved that, they kind of relaxed back in their chairs a little bit. They were served dinner because the time was now about 20:15 local time. And they joined up with the airway Bravo 69, which took them on a route just south of Jakarta. But what the crew didn't know was that beneath them, on the island of Java, a volcano called Gulangong had had a continuous eruption for the last few months. And during that eruption, the volcano had been throwing out loads of lava and volcanic ash high up in the atmosphere. Now, at this time, there was very little knowledge about what kind of effect volcanic ash could have on the aircraft engines. So there was no notice going out to any of the pilots or the airlines about an active volcano in the area. After Captain Moody had finished his meal, he needed to go to the toilet. So before he handed over the controls to First Officer Roger, he took a last scan on the weather radar, and the weather radar showed absolutely nothing. So he got up, handed over the controls to First Officer, went out of the cockpit, And when he went to the crew toilet, he found out that I was occupied. So instead, he took the stairs down to the first class lounge in order to look for a toilet there. And when he reached there, he started chatting with one of the flight attendants about, how life was, something that we tend to do when we go out and visit the toilets. But he had only started chatting to the flight attendant when he was abruptly called back up to the flight deck again by one of the other cabin crew that was still up in the crew quarters. And as he started to walk up the stairs again, he noticed that the vents, the floor vents that is just next to floor level, that there was some white smoke puffing out of those vents.
The stewardess who'd been in the first class, in the upstairs loo, which I tried to get in, came halfway down the stairs and said, "Captain, you're wanted upstairs on the flight deck." So I went upstairs. The first thing I noticed then was that around the lower part of the walls where the air conditioning air comes in, it seemed to be billowing in smoke, and I could smell this acrid electrical burning smell. So I thought, oh dear, I'm going to go on the flight deck and they're going to say, can we fire the fire extinguishers in the electronics bay or something? But nothing was further from the truth, because I went through the door. The other two said, come and look at this, it's beautiful.
When he entered the cockpit, he was greeted with a display that he had never seen before. There was what looked like St. Elmo's fire everywhere over the windshields. St. Elmo's fire is an electrical phenomenon that tends to happen when we fly close to electrically charged particles. So, for example, close to thunderstorms or so, where it looks like a pattern of lightning that moves over the windshield. Now, St. Elmo's fire in itself is not dangerous. In fact, it's quite beautiful. But it does indicate that you tend to be close to thunderstorms. So Captain Eric went back, sat down in his chair. He was very happy to see that the crew had already switched on the continuous ignition on all 4 engines, and he started scanning the weather radar in front of him. But to his amazement, there was no thunderstorms around. In fact, the weather radar was just as clear as it was when he left the cockpit just a few minutes earlier.
When you're going in the flight deck, you see this, you go to sit down. Well, I'm getting into my seat. I'm twiddling the radar to see where this, well, I thought there had to be a big QNIM somewhere and we were in the thin cloud at the top because I thought you needed moisture, because we usually see it in the tops of high QNIMs or other, or when you're on the ground and on the diffuser run the engines up in the winter, you get fog, you can get St. Elmo's fire, and that's what I thought it always had to happen. And I mean, I've never seen it like that before. And well, as I'm buttoning my seatbelt up and I'm fiddling on the radar, I could see no clouds around, as I had before I left the seat. I checked the weather.
But this incredible show of St. Elmo's fire just continued, and as the crew started looking outside of the cockpit back towards the wings and the engines, they realized that there was this bluish glow coming from the leading edges of the wings and also from inside of the engines, creating a very strange stroboscopic effect that, together with the turning fan blade, looked like the fan blades was kind of moving slowly backwards. The pilots had never seen anything like this before, and when they started looking forward towards their windscreen again, they realized that the St. Elmo's fire had been replaced with something that looked like trace fire. If you've seen images from war zones, for example, you know that when they shoot with certain guns, every, 100 bullet or so is a trace bullet that gives those kind of glowing track lines. That's trace fire. And that's exactly what it looked like on their windscreen. But Captain Moody, he was worried about other things, because he had seen that whitish smoke that had been coming out from the air conditioning vents, and he knew that smoke in an aircraft is never a good thing. So he'd started thinking about what to do about this. But before he could even finish that thought, Flight Engineer Barry called out, "Engine failure, engine number 4." The time was now 2040 local time, and this announcement by the flight engineer took the situation to a completely new level. Captain Eric called out, okay, engine failure and shutdown checklist please. And flight engineer Barry started executing that checklist, and that included items like putting the thrust lever back to idle, the engine start lever to cut off, but also in British Airways pulling the engine fire handle, right? Not actually putting any of the extinguishers into the engine, but arming them so that they were ready to use in case they would be needed. As soon as the engine failure shutdown checklist was completed for the number 4 engine, Barry shouted out again. This time he said, engine failure number 2, 3 has gone. They've all gone. So this means that in a matter of a few minutes, this Boeing 747 had gone from a completely controlled normal flight into a flight where now all 4 engines had simultaneously failed. This is a potential catastrophic situation, and the way that the flight crew handles this from this point on is going to be crucial for how successful they are with recovering it. Captain Moody was stunned by this announcement, and he looked down onto his engine instrumentation, and what he saw was a very confusing picture, because on the Boeing 747-200 at the time there were 2 sets of different engine manufacturer indicators. So there was both Smith instrumentation and General Electric instrumentation, and some of them showed the engine values frozen where they were when the engine failed. Other ones went off the scale, making the picture that he was seeing almost impossible to get your head around. And another thing that made him very confused was that he had actually practiced a quad engine failure, as in 4 engine failure scenario in the simulator a few months earlier. But when they did that, almost all of the lighting in the cockpit disappeared, together with all the instrumentation on the first officer side and some other system. But in this scenario, it seemed like at least one of the engines and the generator connected to it was still producing power, giving it a completely different sensation than what he had had in the simulator earlier on. And here, Captain Moody makes a very important decision, because when he looks down on his primary flight instrumentation, he realizes that his speed is starting to tick down. Something that you would expect from an aircraft maintaining 37,000 feet without any engine power. And he also realizes that because he still has some electrical power coming from one of the generators, the autopilot is still working. So he puts the aircraft into a shallow descent, just enough to maintain the airspeed. So he is now focusing on flying the aircraft, making sure that the aircraft doesn't go into a stall and that he has complete control over it. He also initiates a left-hand turn, back north again, okay? Because remember, they have passed the city of Jakarta a few minutes earlier, and they're now out of the sea. If he makes a left-hand turn, he will start heading back towards land and towards a potential airport. He also tells the first officer, Roger, to please send out a mayday call. So at time 20:44, this is 4 minutes after they started seeing the first lights in the cockpit, the following call is made to Jakarta control. Jakarta, Jakarta, mayday, mayday, Speedbird 9, we've lost all 4 engines. We're leaving flight level 370. Initially, air traffic control didn't fully understand this message. They thought that they heard that they had lost engine number 4, which is very different from having lost all 4 engines. But that kind of miscommunication kind of makes sense when you think about the likelihood of hearing that an aircraft has lost all 4 engines. That just doesn't happen.
The engineer and myself went through the first checklist, and I detailed the co-pilot to send out the mayday call, which is when he had the first problems, because there was so much static around the aircraft for obvious reasons that his communications were intelligible, and it took a little while to get through to the Jakarta Air Traffic Control, who's English. I mean, we're talking about 1982. You go out that way now, it's not fantastic, but in 82 it was even worse, and he had great trouble getting through to them because it was a non-standard phrase. All 4 engines had failed. If he'd said number 4 engine has failed, they might have understood that. But he said all 4, and eventually it took a Singapore Airlines airplane who was about half an hour behind us on the same route to relay to them, no, they have no power going. No power.
what has actually happened here, which I'm guessing most of you have already guessed, is that the aircraft has flown into a layer of high altitude volcanic ash. Volcanic ash is spread from a volcano basically in two different ways. So you have the main black plume. That's what you're all thinking about when you're thinking about the volcanic eruption, which is mainly pieces of brimstone, ash, lava, stones that are being thrown out on top of the volcano. But then, higher up, this gets separated into the finer kind of ash dust. And this tends to be whitish in color. If you've ever seen a satellite photo of a volcanic eruption, you tend to see the black main plume going one way, and then you'll see a slight white cloud going a slightly different way. This whiter cloud tends to be containing smaller particles, down to as small as 1 micrometer, and it can travel hundreds of kilometers away from the main volcano. It can also be included in cloud masses and so on. These particles are electrically charged. That's why you sometimes see these lightning bolts from a volcanic eruption. But this is what caused that St. Elmo's fire that the flight crew saw, and also the lights from inside of the engine.
The reason that the weather radar didn't show anything was because the weather radar is not designed to pick up particles as small as the volcanic ash particles are. Remember, volcanic ash can be as small as 1 micrometer, and most of the particles at those altitudes are not much bigger than that. And because of that, the weather radar, which is designed to pick up moisture and droplets, didn't see anything. In order to see things like volcanic ash, you would need a weather radar with a very different wavelength. A smaller wavelength. But the weather radar on board the 747-200 did not have that, hence Captain Moody did not see anything on his weather radar, even though he was surrounded by large concentrations of volcanic ash.
If someone was trying to create a material that was solely designed to disrupt aircraft systems and be damaging to aircraft, then volcanic ash would be pretty close to the ideal material. Because this type of volcanic ash will not just attack one system, it will basically attack all of the aircraft systems. So the main threat obviously is what it's doing to the engine, because these tiny little particles, if you look at them with your naked eye, it looks kind of like baking powder, right? Or baking flour. But if you use a microscope, you will notice that they tend to be mostly silicates, and these silicates are extremely sharp, making this material very abrasive. So the first thing that will happen to the engine is that the engines are sucking in enormous volumes of air. That means that it will concentrate the volcanic ash inside of the engine. And this abrasiveness will start to wear down the fan blades, the compressor blades, and the turbine blades, changing the aerodynamic property of these blades, causing things like engine stalls. But as the ash goes further into the engine and into the hot part, the melting point of these silicates is around 1100 degrees Celsius, while the normal working temperature of a jet engine inside of the core can be as high as 1400 degrees Celsius or higher. So this means that these silicates are now melting into glass, and this will get stuck onto the igniters, onto the fuel nozzles, and onto all of the hot parts, the turbine blades and so on, that's coming after the hot part. And this can stifle the engine completely. But on top of that, this high abrasiveness of the volcanic ash will start sandblasting the outer part of the aircraft. So the aircraft's windows, for example, the pitot tubes, the static probes, the angle of attack vanes, all of those can be damaged, causing faulty instrument readings inside of the cockpit. And then the volcanic ash will get its way in through the air conditioning ducts, for example, stopping veins and valves inside of the air conditioning and being pumped into the aircraft, where it will smell like sulfur, or that acrid smell that Captain Eric Moody felt. Also, it's going to be irritating for eyes, people breathing it in, it's not good for anything. But it also goes into the fuel tanks through to the vents, the air vents, where it contaminates the fuel. So all in all, going into a high-level volcanic ash cloud with high concentrations of ash is a very, very bad thing for the aircraft. The flight crew knows nothing about this, so they are now working frantically on trying to restart the engines. And they're discussing whether or not they're going to try to restart engine number 4 as well. Remember the one that they did the engine failure and shutdown checklist for, because they pulled the fire handle. And if you pull the fire handle, then that engine will not be restarted unless you push that fire handle down again. And together they say, well, you know, we have very little to lose from trying to restart it. So they continue to try to restart all 4 of them, but none of them start to begin with. Instead, as the crew now descending through about 26,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning goes off. That's because the pressurization in the aircraft works with using bleed air from the engines. And since none of the engines are working, there's no bleed air being fed to the aircraft, which means that the pressurization inside of the cabin is starting to leak out in various ways, and the cabin altitude has now reached over 10,000 feet. This means that the flight crew needs to get on oxygen quickly, because they won't be able to last for very long without starting to suffer from hypoxia. So they call for it, they put the masks on, but when the first officer tries to put his mask on, it turns out that it hasn't been fitted properly. So it basically falls to bits in his hands. So Captain Moody is now faced with a very hard decision. Either he can try to maximize his glide using his own oxygen, but risking that his first officer will succumb to hypoxia and become unconscious. Or he can go in and he can do an emergency descent, in which case he would potentially lose, you know, very valuable altitude, but he will have the benefit of his whole flight crew with him. He decides on doing the emergency descent, which means that he's now pitching the aircraft forward into a dive. But as he's doing this, the standard operating procedure for the 747 to do this would be to lower the landing gear as well, to get maximum drag during this maneuver. But he discusses this with his fellow pilots, and they decide not to do this because they know that lowering the landing gear will require a lot of hydraulic fluid. But none of the engines are working, which means that they don't know how much hydraulic pressure they have. And they don't want to risk lowering the landing gear and then not having any flight controls to control the aircraft. So they decide to keep the landing gear up, they start diving, and here is also where Captain Moody realizes that there is a difference of indicated airspeed on his airspeed indicator to what is shown on his first officer's one. Remember how we talked about how the volcanic ash can come into the pitot tubes? Well, in any case, he decides that his, which is showing around 320 knots, is probably the one that is working better. So he decides to focus and continue to use his own airspeed indicator. This type of discussion that the flight crew is now having about very complex systems and how these systems might react in a situation they've never faced before shows a very good understanding and situational awareness of the aircraft. And on top of this, First Officer Roger, as they're now descending, has managed to fix his own oxygen mask, so he can now put it on and get oxygen properly. And this means that as the aircraft is descending past about 20,000 feet now, the crew levels off the aircraft, continues to descend, but not with such a rapid descent rate anymore. Because now they're facing the next problem. And the next problem is that the mountains ahead of them, between them and Jakarta, are quite high. They have a safety height of 10,500 feet. So the crew needs to decide whether or not they can actually glide past these mountains safely. And what they decide is that if they reach 12,000 feet and they haven't managed to start any of the engines, which means that they will continue to descend, well then, instead of trying to transgress the mountain range, they will just make a right-hand turn out of the sea again and try to ditch the aircraft in the water. And this consideration was another reason that Captain Moody didn't want to lower the landing gear, because he knew that if he had lowered the landing gear, he wouldn't be able to retract it, and if he would have to ditch the aircraft in the ocean, he did not want to do so with the landing gear selected down. The crew continues throughout this entire descent to try to relight the engines. They take turns trying each engine to see if one would start when the other one wouldn't. But initially, none of them will start. However, when they're putting fuel into the engines are actually igniting. They're just not starting up properly. But that has a secondary effect of showing flames coming out to the back of the engines. And this means that the poor passengers that are sitting at the back of the aircraft, they, if they were looking out of the wings, would be shown of a display of 4 engines on fire, which would be absolutely terrifying. And with this in mind, Captain Moody decides that he needs to make a PA, right? He needs to say something to the passengers to reassure them. And the PA he makes is probably going to go to the history as one of the most understated PAs ever made.
I said, well, if I'm going to talk to on the passenger address, I'm going to talk to the passengers as well. They're going to hear everything I say. So really, I suppose I've got to sound laid back, laconic, in control, and I have to tell them something. But what do I tell them? And my intent was to get the attention of the CSD and the cabin crew, and I got the attention of the world's press. And I didn't intend to do that, but I did. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Eric Moody again. We have a small problem in that all 4 engines have failed. We're doing our utmost to get them going. I trust you're not in too much distress. And would the CSD please come to the flight deck? And that little bit at the end is a signal to, in British
landing gear, we require a lot of hydraulic fluid. Pressure they have, and they don't want to risk lowering the landing gear and then not having any flight controls to control the aircraft. So they decide to keep the landing gear up. They start diving, and here is also where Captain Moody realizes that there is a difference of indicated airspeed on his airspeed indicator to what is shown on his first officer's one. In any case, he decides before descending, because now 10,000 the aircraft. He did not want to do so with the landing gear selected down. The port was absolutely terrifying. And with this in mind, Captain Moody decides that he needs to make a PA, right? He needs to say something to the passengers to reassure them. And the PA he makes is probably going to go to the history as one of the most understated PAs ever made.
I said, well, if I'm going to talk on the passenger address, I'm going to talk to the passengers as well. They're going to hear everything I say. So really, I suppose I've got to sound laid back, laconic, in control, and I have to tell them something. But what do I tell them? And my intent was to get the attention of the CSD and the cabin crew, and I got the attention of the world's press. And I didn't intend to do that, but I did. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Eric Moody again. We have a small problem in that all 4 engines have failed. We're doing our utmost to get them going. I trust you're not in too much distress. And would the CSD please come to the flight deck? And that little bit at the end is a signal to, in British Airways, for the cabin crew to prepare for a crash landing or a ditching.
After the PA, the cabin crew is invited into the cockpit, and Captain Moody is trying to give them briefing about what's going on, but because he still is wearing his oxygen mask, he finds it very hard to communicate. And the purser doesn't hear anything of what he's saying, but he understands that he is actually, doing more harm than good in the cockpit, so he just nods and gets out of the cockpit, goes down to brief the rest of the crew about a potential emergency landing. The jumbo jet is now getting close to their cutoff altitude of 12,000 feet, and Captain Eric is starting to think about the possibility that they might have to ditch this huge aircraft in the ocean. And he's well aware that trying to ditch an aircraft of this size at night, where it's extremely hard to judge the height over the waves, has a very low likelihood of succeeding. But as he's starting to contemplate this, he's interrupted by the jubilation from his fellow crew members when the number 4 engine starts up. Remember the first one that they shut down? That one is now starting up. And after that, in fairly quick succession, they managed to start all 4 engines. So Initially, they reduce the descent rate. With the second engine being started, they can start a very shallow climb, and then eventually they have all 4 engines available to them. And Captain Eric now wants to get up, get away from the mountains and get precious altitude as quickly as possible. And this is not the end of the troubles for this crew, and I'm going to tell you all about it after this short message from my sponsor. I also want to take a few seconds here to say a special thank you to the sponsor of this episode, which is Skillshare. Now, I know that you are watching this because you are a curious person, a lifelong learner, someone who constantly wants to improve and understand the world around you better. And in that case, Skillshare is definitely something that you should be checking out. Okay, they have thousands of high-quality video courses in pretty much anything that you can imagine. A course that I'm using myself at the moment is 5 Minutes Creativity with Jasmine Cheyenne, where she gives kind of hands-on tips on how to chisel out a few minutes to be creative every single day, and it's something that I personally really need. But there are also courses in, storytelling, creative photography, or even how to use your own home simulator to improve and prepare before you start your private pilot license. So if you think, Peter, that sounds amazing, well then the 1,001st of you guys who clicks on this link here below will get 1 month of premium Skillshare absolutely for free. So click the link and start exploring your curiosity today. At time 2057, that's 17 minutes after the crew first started seeing the St. Elmo's fire outside of the aircraft, the first officer called up Jakarta Control with the following message. Jakarta Speedbird 9, we're back in business, all 4 engines operating. The crew was now anxious to try to climb up to gain some precious altitude again, because remember, they didn't know whether or not the engines would fail again on them, and if they could get a little bit more altitude, it meant that they could potentially climb over the mountain range and reach Jakarta. So they put some extra trust on the engines, they started climbing, and when they reached about 15,000 feet, the St. Elmo's fire phenomenon was back on the windscreen. And as they leveled off at 15,000 feet, the thrust came back, the number 2 engine started vibrating so violently that they thought that it was going to seriously damage the aircraft, so they reluctantly shut down engine number 2 again. Now remember, the crew still doesn't know why this is happening, but Captain Moody is now starting to kind of put 2 and 2 together and think that this phenomenon that's causing the St. Elmo's fire outside maybe has something to do with the engine failures as well. So he decides that they need to get out of it. They need to descend back down to 12,000 feet where they know that this phenomenon was not there. Before we go any further, I just want to give you a possible explanation to why the crew was actually able to start the engines again. Remember how we talked about how the ash would melt and stick to internal components inside of the engine? Well, it is very possible that as the engines were cooling down after the failures, this melted ash started to get really hard. And as they were trying to restart the engines, it broke off the internal components, enabling the rotating parts to start rotating again, and thus enabling them to start the engines. But now, since the crew has once again entered the ash cloud and now the engines are starting to heat up again, it was really crucial that they descended out of it as quickly as possible. The crew now asked for the weather in Jakarta. The weather in Jakarta was beautiful, clear sky, no clouds, light and variable winds. So they started receiving radar vectors in towards Jakarta. They were very reluctant to change the thrust setting because they knew that the engines were operating at the thrust setting that they had. So instead they were using drag, like speed brakes for example, to control the speed and the descent rate of the aircraft. They were vectored in for a traffic circuit in a right-hand pattern in towards Jakarta, and as they were turning in towards the runway, they realized that they had real problems seeing the airport. No matter how they tried to look for it, even though it was clear outside, they just could not see the runway. And they very quickly realized that the reason they couldn't see it was because their windscreens was completely opaque. They were completely sandblasted and was like looking through a shower curtain. But they managed to find on both the right and the left-hand side a small strip of windscreen which they could look through. The next problem here was that the ILS in Jakarta had an inoperative glide slope, so they didn't have an ILS, an instrument landing system, available. Instead, they had to fly a localizer approach, which would have been normal procedures if it weren't for the fact that even as they get closer to the minima, they wouldn't be able to see the runway. So the crew worked together. Captain Eric was flying the localizer, getting distances and altitude checks from the first officer, and basically descending based on what the first officer was telling him, creating kind of a virtual glide slope. Very much the same way that we fly constant angle non-precision approaches today. And in interviews later on, Captain Moody has described the way that he had to fly this localizer approach without being able to see the runway. It was like negotiating your way up a badger's ass. That was a great way of explaining it. Anyway, as they got closer to the runway and Captain Moody could look out through that little strip of window that he could see, he managed to get the aircraft down towards the runway. But it felt like an eternity before the landing gear finally touched the ground in a really nice, smooth butter landing. And as the aircraft touched down, the crew received what is potentially the world's most deserved applause and jubilations from the passengers in the aircraft. This is an amazing feat. It's an amazing show of teamwork. It's an amazing show of communication, situational awareness, and airmanship. Now, the crew then decided that they wanted to try to taxi the aircraft off the runway. But as soon as they turned off the runway and they were faced with the lights from the apron and from the terminals, it basically just flooded their completely opaque flight deck window. So instead, they just stopped the aircraft and asked for a toggle to pull them in towards their parking position.
The windows have gone opaque, even down the side, because they were all sandblasted, but the front ones to a greater extent. So when we turned around, I couldn't see out either. I couldn't see the side of the runway, and he had to taxi it back. We got to and turned off, and once we faced the terminal building, neither of us could see out, so we just stopped it, switched the engines off, and I went downstairs to, while we waited for the tug to come out, just to talk to the first class passengers. And there was actually an old captain in there, an old BOAC captain, who wanted to tell me the story about he'd lost 4 engines on the Lancaster over Bermuda during the war. I just didn't want to know, but there we go. He didn't think it was anything fascinating. And I sat on my hands, as one does on a table in the middle of the flight of the first class cabin. And when I got back upstairs, I was getting in my seat to be towed in, and I looked at my hands and I said to the other two, "Look at that black." And the engineer said, "I reckon that's volcanic dust."
There were several days before the crew was told the reason for their quadruple engine failure, but they had kind of figured it out already. As they disembarked the aircraft, they noticed that there was a lot of volcanic ash on the whole aircraft. The airspace around the active volcano was closed down for a few weeks, but then opened up again. And only 19 days later, Singapore Airlines Boeing 747 flew into the same area and had to shut down 3 of its engines. And after that, they permanently closed down the airspace until the volcanic eruption had subsided. What happened to the flight crew then? Well, the flight crew was given several commendations, among them the Queen's Commendation for valuable service in the air and a couple of medals from the British Airline Pilot Association. The 747 in itself was ferried back to London a few days after this incident, where they replaced one of the engines, and then it continued to operate for British Airways for several years before it went over to the ownership of European Air Charter, and then finally was taken out of commission in 2004. This incident and other incidents involving volcanic ash really opened up the eyes to the aviation industry about the dangers of flying into volcanic ash. So it had a huge impact on the way that we are training in the simulator now, where we have regular training scenarios on how to effectively deal with if you for some reason fly into an ash cloud. What has been shown is that what's really important is to exit the ash cloud as soon as possible and try to maintain as low engine thrust as possible in order to get the core temperature of the engines down when you're escaping. If a flight crew today would enter into an area where we believe that there might be a high concentration of volcanic ash, we are taught to do the following. we turn around 180 degrees around. We set a lower altitude on our mode control panel. We hit level change so the aircraft starts descending, and then we disconnect the auto throttle and close the thrust levers, right? So make sure that we have minimum thrust, and then we continue to, well, hopefully get out of the ash cloud, deal with any engine malfunctions that we might have, if there might be increases in exhaust gas temperature, or if the engine stops responding to thrust lever input. There are checklists to do this. But the important thing here is that we know what to do if we see these telltale signs that the crew of British Airways Flight 9 encountered. Also, the meteorological services around the world are now very keen on checking if there is a volcanic eruption somewhere to predict where the ash cloud might move and to declare those non-fly zones. Okay, we all remember what happened after the volcanic eruption on Iceland, which basically stopped the aviation business in Europe for several days. But now we are also better at predicting this. All right, we're better at knowing where the ash clouds are and completely avoiding them. So once again, this was an incident that has made the aviation world safer. It's made our understanding about this particular phenomenon better. And that's what I wanted to give you through this video. As always, guys, I hope that you have enjoyed this video. I hope that I have earned a subscription from you. In that case, make sure that you highlight the little notification bell as well, so that you know when I'm coming out with more material. If you want to support the channel, then the best way of doing so is becoming a member of my Patreon crew. I really appreciate all of my members. They're supporting me both financially, but also by giving me valuable feedback about my videos. We have weekly Zoom hangouts where we talk about everything from what they're doing in their lives to what questions they have about aviation, and it's really, really fun to do so. If you think that that sounds like something you want to do, then go into patreon.com/mentorpilot. There's a link in the description below as well, and you can support with as little or as much as you like. Everything is appreciated. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Imagine being really, really tired. You know that feeling when your eyes just doesn't want to stay open and you just keep nodding off? Well, now imagine that you're feeling like that, but you're in charge of a 50-ton aircraft that is just about to start a quite unusual and demanding type of approach in really poor weather. Stay tuned. In order to explain how this accident flight came to be, I have to start by explaining a bit about its background. You see, during the early 1990s, the meat industry was undergoing a big change inside of the United Kingdom. Prior to this, there had been more than 1,000 slaughterhouses available inside of the UK borders, but because of more lax regulations that had been implemented after the UK joined the European community, several of those had gone out of business, and this had caused long waiting times and higher costs for the UK meat producers. As a consequence of this, live cattle had started to be transported to slaughterhouses outside of the UK borders to, among other places, the Netherlands, France, and even Spain. These transports could easily take up to 24 hours or even more, and the animals were often left without food or water during that time, leading to a lot of unnecessary suffering. Animal rights groups had noticed this practice and started several campaigns to try and highlight this to the general public, which had succeeded. Huge protests followed in several parts of the country, mainly outside ports and railway stations where these type of transports originated from. Those protests eventually caused several transport companies, mainly those who also transported people, to ban these type of transport. But that in turn just meant that the livestock companies now needed to find other ways to get their animals to the slaughterhouses in Europe. In August of 1994, one of these companies reached out to a transport company called Phoenix Aviation to see if they would be able to transport some calves by air, primarily down to Amsterdam from the UK. Phoenix Aviation was a charter organization, and it didn't have its own air operator certificate, which is something that you need if you intend to operate your own aircraft or crew. Instead, they relied on contracting other airlines to operate their charters, and they normally worked with different African airlines. an agreement was quickly struck to carry out continuous daily flights, initially between Bournemouth and Amsterdam using a cargo-converted Boeing 737-200 from Air Algérie. Air Algérie would provide the aircraft and the operating crews, but Phoenix Aviation would stand for all of the other costs. The converted Boeing 737-200 was able to transport 191 animals per flight in 6 palletized pens, and the plan was to operate flights every 4 hours throughout the day and night in order to fill the quota of 5,000 livestock transported per week. To handle the animals during the flight, 2 cattle handlers would be sitting in the back of the aircraft, meaning that each flight would have a total of 5 people on board: the pilot, an engineer who would handle refueling and minor technical fixes, and the 2 handlers. The operation was scheduled to start in October 1994, but due to some ingenious paperwork exercises involving several different air operator certificates, the actual approval for operating these flights had not yet been secured when the flights actually started. Anyway, the aircraft arrived in Bournemouth on the 20th of October 1994 and started operating the cargo flights immediately. But pretty soon, a problem arose, because the purpose of the flights had quickly spread among the general public, causing local opposition and protests. This soon prompted Phoenix Aviation to switch operating base from Bournemouth to Coventry Airport, which was a bit closer to their own headquarters. The same type of local opposition obviously quickly sprung up there as well, but Phoenix successfully won a court case approving them to continue the operation, and after that, Coventry became the de facto base of these cargo flights. Now, even though Phoenix Aviation had legally won the right to operate from Coventry, there were still considerable protests happening outside of the airport, especially around the departure times, and that required police presence. And this brings us to the aircraft in question. The aircraft had registration 7 Tango Victor Echo Echo and was, like I mentioned before, a Boeing 737-200 which had been manufactured back in 1973 and been with Air Algérie ever since. It was in generally good working condition, but already back in 1994, this was a quite antiquated aircraft with only a very rudimentary autopilot and flight director system. The cockpit was completely original, with steam gauges, and its ILS receivers and control boxes were also from the 70s, which will become very important in this story. You see, when the Instrument Landing System, ILS, was first introduced, it was allocated a frequency range in the VHF band between 108.1 to 111.9 MHz. It was decided that 20 channels should be enough, so an ILS frequency was dedicated to every odd decimal value, 108.1, 108.3, and so on. But it very soon became clear that more channels than that would be needed. So in 1976, 20 more channels were introduced and allocated frequencies 0.05 MHz above the existing frequencies, meaning 108.15, 108.35, and so on. But in order for these new channels to work, the aircraft needed to upgrade both the ILS receiver and its control boxes. On the accident aircraft, the control boxes had not been upgraded, meaning that only certain ILSs could be flown, those corresponding with the old channels. The ILS frequency in Coventry was 109.75, and that meant that the Air Algérie crews who were going to operate into there would not be able to use the ILS, which would become a problem given the UK wintertime weather. So, if the normal ILS system didn't work, which was by far the most common, easy way for the aircraft to be guided down towards the runway, well then, what would they going to use? Well, the second best thing, providing there was no VOR approach available, was something known as a surveillance radar approach, or SRA. As the name suggests, this is a radar-led type of approach where the radar operator in the tower will give verbal instructions to the pilots on how to maneuver the aircraft horizontally to maintain the center line. The radar operator will also give the pilots guidance on which altitudes they should be at given distances from a DME station, but during the approach there's no way for the radar operator to actually see what altitudes that the aircraft is flying, so the pilots will have to monitor that by themselves. And because of that lack of vertical feedback, this type of approach is known as a non-precision approach, and therefore had higher minimum descent height, or minima, which is the lowest altitude that the aircraft could legally descend to, as well as higher visibility requirements. During the final approach part of an SRA, there is no need for the pilots to read back the clearances because the transmission from air traffic control will be continuous and can sound something like this. 3 miles from touchdown, your height should be 950 feet. On track, turn left heading 238. 238 is the heading. 2.5 miles from touchdown, your height should be 800 feet, and so on. The idea is that the pilot should try and adapt the descent rate to follow what we call a constant descent approach, meaning that they will fly with a descent that looks similar to what it would be like if they flew a normal ILS. There is also another way to fly a non-precision approach, and that's what we refer to as a dive and drive technique. In that case, the pilots can descend much quicker down to the published minima and then maintain that height in level flight until they either see the runway or reach a defined missed approach point. If they haven't been able to establish visual contact with the runway before reaching that point, well, then a go-around will be initiated. Now, both of these procedures are legal from a strict terrain clearance point of view, but the dive and drive technique will not conform to the stabilized approach criteria. Already back in 1994, most airlines had stopped flying approaches using that technique, but its existence is worth remembering for what's about to happen. Given the very rudimentary autopilot that was fitted to the 737-200, flying these SRAs could mean quite high workload for the pilots, and it was quite rare to even come across an SRA in real life. It was never really practiced in the simulator, and me personally, I've only flown one on a few times in my career, so the pilots wouldn't have been very used to them. The pilots who were going to operate Air Algérie Flight 702 Papa had arrived to the UK from Algeria a few days before the flight on Sunday, the 18th of December 1994. The captain was 44 years old with 10,686 hours of total experience and 2,187 of those flown on the Boeing 737-200. He was accompanied by a 35-year-old first officer who had a total experience of 2,858 hours, of which the majority, 2,055 hours, were flown on the same aircraft. They had been allocated a hotel close to the airport, which was also where Air Algérie had set up their temporary base with briefing facilities and access to Phoenix Aviation representatives. The following day, Monday the 19th, they attended a briefing session in the morning before operating 4 sectors between Coventry and Amsterdam, starting at 12:30 and finishing their duty at 20:30 in the evening. The weather was beautiful during the day and no problems were reported. It is likely that they mostly flew visual approaches into Coventry on that day, and in Amsterdam the ILS frequency was compatible with the aircraft, so it could be flown without a problem. After the flights, the pilots were allocated more than 27 hours of rest until just before midnight the following evening, when they were scheduled for a night session of 4 more sectors to the same destination. Now, I really want to emphasize here that going from operating a day shift to a night shift can be really tricky from a rest perspective. Even though sufficient legal rest has been allocated, it doesn't necessarily mean that the pilots could get some actual sleep in the evening before their flights. In any case, the duty on the following day was scheduled with a check-in for the flight at 23:45, with the first departure at 30 minutes past midnight on the 21st. If everything went according to schedule, they would then arrive at 07:30 in the morning after the 4th flight, which was within the maximum duty time limitation for night flights in Air Algérie of 7 hours and 45 minutes after 4 sectors. Now, on top of that could be put a 5th sector in case of a diversion and also a non-defined commander's discretion additive of duty time. But under UK legislation, this was limited to a maximum of 3 hours extra. Now, if this sounds like a lot, it is. But remember that this was back in 1994 and a lot of changes in duty time limitations have happened since then. And actually, what we are about to see happening to these pilots is an excellent example of why we have better flight time limitations today, and I'll tell you all about this after this. So, if you've been following my channels lately, you probably know that I am super invested in learning more about the use of AI and other technological advancements to improve my work. Keeping up with technological changes means acquiring new skills, and lately I've found that the best way to tackle this challenge is through Brilliant, today's sponsor. Brilliant offers thousands of quick, visual, hands-on lessons that you can access anytime, helping you to master key concepts in a fun and effective way. I must mention that the logic courses offered by Brilliant have significantly advanced my ability to structure my arguments and communicate my ideas more effectively, especially when presenting on camera. You can also access Brilliant on your phone, so instead of mindlessly scrolling through social media, I use those moments to level up my understanding of topics like, for example, computer science. Brilliant has become my go-to tool for continuous growth, and now you can try out everything that Brilliant has to offer absolutely for free for a full 30 days. Just head over to brilliant.org/mentorpilot or simply click on the link in the description below. Oh, and there's a special treat here. If you're among the first 200 to take advantage of this opportunity, you'll get a fantastic 20% discount on Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Huge shout out to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the story. The pilots and flight engineer arrived to the aircraft as planned around 23:45, but because of some issues with the loading of the livestock, the first departure became slightly delayed. The first officer was going to be pilot flying for the first two sectors, so he started setting up the cockpit for departure as the captain checked out the tech log and did a walk around. The aircraft had no written defects on it, but the ILS receiver had been changed a few weeks earlier in order to try and fix the issue with it, but because the control box had not also been changed, this had been unsuccessful. The first officer briefed and called for the checklist, and at time 0059 they finally took off from runway 23 and started their first flight down towards Amsterdam. There had been no real NOTAMs to take into account, and the weather was initially very nice, but there was a forecast of possible fog during the early morning hours later on. The aircraft landed safely in Amsterdam, unloaded the cargo, and then returned empty towards Coventry again. During the descent, they received the weather from the en route air traffic controller in London, and it was still beautiful, with 20 kilometers of visibility and a scattered cloud layer at 4,500 feet. The pilots tried to tune the ILS for the arrival, but as expected, it didn't work, and instead they opted for an S.i.R approach, which was conducted without any kind of problem. Records later showed that they had descended more or less exactly according to the constant descent profile, and they landed safely on runway 23 at time 0342. Now before we continue, it's probably worth mentioning that the minimus used during an S.i.R approach depends on to which distance the radar controller continues the approach guidance. In the case of Coventry, this was either 650 feet height and 1,100 meters visibility for guidance to 2 nautical miles, or 370 feet height and the same visibility for a guidance to either 1 or half a nautical mile. Providing that this height was not crossed without positive visual contact with the runway, all obstacles in the approach area would be passed with a safe margin. Now, which point the controller decided to use was based on the current weather, and it would be reported to the pilots prior to commencing the approach so that they could set their minimus. In the UK, there was also a national rule known as approach ban. This rule basically stated that an approach could not be initiated if the reported visibility was below the minimum stated for the approach. This was to try and stop pilots from trying approaches when the visibility was too low and potentially make some bad mistakes. Now, in reality, it is always up to the commander of the aircraft to decide what approach can be flown or not, but the controllers could then report non-compliances with this rule to the authorities. On the ground in Coventry, the next load of livestock was loaded onto the aircraft, and at time 0452, the crew took off again towards Amsterdam, this time with the captain as pilot flying. Again, the flight was perfectly normal and they flew a successful ILS approach into runway 19 right and landed at time 0551. After the aircraft had taxied into the unloading platform in Amsterdam, the pilots received the updated weather for Coventry. The latest terminal area forecast, or TAF, now clearly indicated that fog with visibility around 800 meters was likely between 0400 and 0900 in the morning. This didn't bother the crew too much because the weather at their alternates were still good, and the company had asked them to upload tanker fuel to enable a subsequent flight down to Rennes in France without having to upload any more fuel in Coventry. So that meant that they would have loads of fuel on board. The final fuel count was recorded as 10,500 kilos, and the calculated burn for this sector was only 2,400 kilos. As the aircraft took off on this planned final sector at time 0642, the weather had already started to deteriorate in Coventry. The visibility dropped first to 3,500 meters in mist and then at 0620 to 800 meters in fog, in other words below the S.i.R minima of 1100 meters. The captain was once again pilot flying on this flight with call sign ACE702, and just like on the previous flight, they received the Coventry weather from London Control during their initial descent. This meant that as they were handed over to Coventry approach, they only received the runway visual range, or RVR value, of 700 meters and not the actual full weather report. The captain asked the first officer to request another SRA approach, which was granted, but this time it was flown all the way down to the minima without any visual runway contact being made by the crew. As the radar guidance terminated at half a mile from the runway, the captain executed a normal missed approach and climbed to 2,000 feet in accordance with the missed approach procedure. They then entered a holding pattern around the Coventry NDB, non-directional beacon, to plan their next move. Now, for those of you who have been paying attention, this approach should not have been flown at all, given the UK approach ban rule. It is a bit unclear if the pilots chose to disregard the ban or if they just weren't aware that it even existed, since it was a local UK restriction. In any case, the later evidence showed that this initial SRA approach had also been flown using the correct constant descent technique, just like the earlier approach had been. The pilots now started gathering weather information from their alternate airport. Birmingham, which was very close, had similar weather as Coventry with fog and low visibility, but East Midlands Airport was fine with a visibility of 3,500 meters in mist and scattered clouds at 6,000 feet. Since they still had loads of fuel on board, there was no immediate hurry to divert, and they decided to wait in the hold for at least 20 more minutes until 8 o'clock local time to see if there were any improvements. But at time 0749, Phoenix Aviation relayed a message to them, asking them to please divert to East Midlands and wait there instead. Now, this actually seemed like a good advice, since the weather on the ground below them was actually getting worse, with a visibility of just around 600 meters. But remember, the pilots had already been on duty for over 8 hours in long night flights at this point, so having to divert is tiring in itself, and it's really hard on the last sector in these kind of circumstances. So I completely understand why they wanted to wait and hopefully get back down and land at the base instead. Anyway, after having received that message, the pilots now notified air traffic control about their decision to divert, but were initially told to remain in the holding pattern. Here, the first signs of fatigue is starting to really show from the pilots, because as they were told to remain in the holding pattern, the first officer asked the controller to repeat that message, as if he didn't quite understand it. And 3 minutes after that confirmation, at time 0753, the air traffic controllers suddenly saw how the aircraft exited the holding pattern without clearance and just started tracking towards their alternate East Midlands. This caused a potential conflict with inbound traffic to Birmingham, which the controllers quickly resolved, but an occurrence report was later filed from both Coventry and Birmingham control centres about this uncleared manoeuvre. Once the conflict was resolved, the aircraft received clearance to continue direct towards East Midlands Airport, and at time 0758, the crew was offered radar vectors towards an ILS approach for runway 27. Unfortunately though, the frequency of the ILS there was 109.35, again outside of the reach of their nav receiver, so the captain, who had now taken over the radio communications, advised that they were unable to get the ILS working at the moment, but that they would advise if they got the indication. We don't know if the captain had handed over the controls to the first officer for the diversion, or if he was just doing the radio and flying at this point. It is quite possible that he did, because this diversion was a bit outside of normal operations, and the captain's English knowledge was much better than the first officer's. When the aircraft was about 8.5 nautical miles away from the airport, the captain reported that they had the runway in sight, and they were subsequently cleared for a visual approach. The first officer again took over the radios from that point, and the aircraft landed safely in East Midlands at time 0808 and taxied into the apron. Once the aircraft was properly shut down, the captain got into contact with the Phoenix Aviation representative in Coventry. He was then advised that they would have to wait in East Midlands until the weather improved and then fly back again, since it was impossible to move the livestock down to East Midlands for the next transport. The crew was also told to head over to the restaurant and get some breakfast and keep checking the weather for updates. At this point, the pilots had already exceeded their max normal duty time, but since they had diverted, they could still operate a last sector according to the captain's discretion to recover the aircraft back to base. We don't really know how much discussions were made regarding this subject, but we do know that they ultimately took the fateful decision to keep operating. Here, it should be mentioned that back in 1994, crew resource management or CRM training was not yet mandatory in all airlines. In the case of Air Algérie, only the first officer had gone through a CRM course at the start of his training, but the captain still had not. CRM training is much more than just instructions on how to work well together in a team. It also includes things like fatigue and stress management, as well as self-evaluation and critique. And it's possible that this last sector might have been diffused if the crew was more aware of how tired they actually were. Around 0900, a Phoenix Aviation representative looked outside of his window in Coventry and saw that the weather appeared to be improving. He called up the air traffic service unit in Coventry Tower, where a brand new service assistant was doing his very first day on the job. He gave an assessment of the weather as indeed improving, with a visibility of 1200 meters and a cloud base of 600 feet. But later, there was no official records found about this weather report, and instead, the official weather at the time was considerably worse, with visibility still below the minimums for the S.i.R approach. Unfortunately, the improving values was the weather that was being passed on to the captain, who used that as the basis for his decision to dispatch again for the short flight back to Coventry. And it was a very short flight. The straight line distance from East Midlands Airport to Coventry Airport was just 34 miles, which would mean an airborne time of less than 15 minutes. During extremely short flights like this, it's quite common for us pilots to brief both the departure and the approach on the ground prior to the flight. This would enable them to concentrate fully on the flight itself once airborne, but there was no indication that this took place before this particular flight. Instead, the first officer now again started setting up the cockpit for departure, this time with call sign ACE 702 Papa. The checklists were completed, and at time 0937, the 737-200 got airborne from runway 27 in East Midlands with its two cigar-shaped turbofan engines roaring into the crisp UK morning sky. The crew were initially cleared to maintain runway heading and to climb to flight level 40, which is around 4,000 feet. 40 seconds after takeoff, they were further cleared to turn towards the Coventry NDB and make two quick frequency changes. The captain was handling the radios, and these radio calls delayed the completion of the after takeoff checklist slightly, but soon the aircraft had retracted the flaps and was accelerated to 280 knots as they pointed the nose towards Coventry. This is a small but important point. First of all, the maximum speed in this type of airspace, below flight level 100, was 250 knots, but even that would likely have been far too fast in this type of situation. Accelerating the aircraft to its cruise speed of 280 knots was completely unnecessary for a distance of only 34 miles, and shows some lapses of situational awareness already at this point, likely caused by fatigue or just willingness to get the flight over with quickly. A more sensible speed would have been around 220 knots or so, which would have enabled the pilots to take the weather and also to probably do a quick approach briefing. Now, we also don't know if the autopilot was used or if the first officer flew this whole flight completely manually. Like I mentioned before, the autopilot was really simple on the 737-200, and it only really had an altitude hold as well as an approach function that could be used for ILS approaches. This aircraft also lacked altitude bugs on the main altimeters, which could be used as visual reminders of the altitude minimums, and because of that, there was also no audible minimums warnings in the cockpit. Everything simply relied on the pilot monitoring calling those things out. As the aircraft got closer to Coventry, the air traffic controller asked them to change their transponder code and to continue flying towards Coventry NDB at flight level 40. The pilots asked if they could initiate their descent and were told to initially descend to 2,500 feet and to turn left onto heading of 110 degrees for vectors towards runway 23. This was correctly read back, the aircraft started turning, and the pilots were advised that they were identified on radar. As this was going on, there was no approach briefing done in the cockpit, only a call from the captain to set 232, which was the inbound course for the SRA, likely to be set on their HSIs. And at this point, there was also a short mention from the captain about the weather still being really bad. The descent and approach checklists had all been completed by the captain as soon as the after takeoff checklists were completed, but there was no indication that the last point on the approach checklist, altimeters and instruments, had actually been set. They also had not received any new full weather report at this stage, so they were still likely relying on the positive weather report that they had received on the ground a few minutes earlier. And the ATC controllers, who had received little warning of the aircraft coming into their airspace, did not give them the full weather either, because inbound flights normally would have received that from London Control, like in the previous flights. All of this meant that the aircraft was now getting closer to the approach, but without knowing that the visibility on the ground was still below minimums. Now, what could have given the crew some false assurance here was the fact that the fog was quite shallow, and it had indeed started thinning out in places. This meant that the aircraft was flying in clear skies as they were descending, and they likely could see the ground in between the patches of fog below them. The Coventry approach controller, who had now taken over the flight, told them in one long transmission to set QFE 1013. This was the pressure setting which was going to give them the height over the airport rather than the altitude over the sea, which was the standard procedure for this type of approach back in that time. And then to continue to descend to 1,500 feet and turn left heading 030 degrees. The captain read back the height and pressure setting correctly, but instead of 030 degrees, he read back 080 degrees. The controller heard this and told him to now please turn left to heading 010 degrees, which was read back as right turn to heading 010. Again, this was not correct, but the controller did not correct it because she could see that the aircraft had actually started turning left. These type of readback mistakes are quite good indications of potential fatigue when it comes from experienced flight crews like this one. Another sign of that came a few minutes later when the controller saw that the heading of the aircraft hadn't changed as expected, and instead it was heading out to leave her radar area. She again called them up and repeated her request for a left turn to heading 010 degrees. The captain responded that they were indeed maintaining that heading, but the problem was that they were flying 100 degrees instead of 010 degrees, a full 90 degrees off. This was quickly rectified by the controller, who told them that she would be taking them through the extended center line for some extra spacing. She also asked if they were able to fly an ILS approach or if they needed an SRA. This seemed to confuse the captain, who asked what she meant by that message, and the matter was never really fully resolved. The controller instead assumed that an SRA would be required and started giving closing vectors for this by giving the crew a left turn to 260 degrees. She initially aimed to provide an SRA down to 2 nautical miles and relay this to the crew, who were also asked to check your minima and missed approach point. But that was never read back because the captain responded with a request for a cooperation with an SRA approach, which the controller just confirmed that's actually what she was planning. This all meant that there was never a response to the controller's prompt to check minima and missed approach point, a fact that would become critical quite soon. The cockpit voice recorder picked up very little conversations between the two pilots during this whole flight duration, but what was picked up was several prompts from the captain regarding the first officer's flying, including when to reduce speed and start taking flaps, more indications of possible fatigue. As they were getting closer to the center line, they started configuring by first selecting flaps 1, then 5, and then 10. The captain at this point also mentioned that if they couldn't get down on the first attempt, they could just go around and try again, but to pay attention to the fuel. At that time, they still had over 6,000 kilos in the tank, so they had plenty of fuel for several approaches and even a possible second diversion if needed. The aircraft was now closing in on the center line gently from the left, and at a 10 nautical miles final, the controller asked the crew to, at your convenience, check your wheels, which prompted the crew to select gear down, flap 15, after which they confirmed that the gear was down to the controller. As this was happening, the controller had decided to, instead of providing an SRA approach to 2 miles, she would continue to 1 mile instead, giving the poor weather on the ground. But this decision was not communicated to the pilots. Taking that decision was the correct thing to do, but it would also enable a lower minimum descent height to be used, and if she would have communicated this to the crew, it might have reminded them about the minima and also to verify the current RVR, but that sadly didn't happen. Anyway, the controller now told the crew that they were now established on the descent line and that they could start the descent from 1500 feet and maintain a 3-degree glide slope once they passed 4.5 nautical miles. This was read back and acknowledged by the captain. Here now followed a really interesting discussion that might give an explanation to what happened next. The first officer said, "We can see the ground." And the captain responded that, "Yeah, well, from time to time, it's not always the case." The first officer then said, "Well, in patches." And the captain continued, "Otherwise, we can come here and try to get below the clouds." It's hard to know what the captain meant by that, but it could be an indication of an idea to try and dive and drive down below the fog banks and hopefully see the runway earlier that way. The controller kept giving heading corrections to follow, and the captain prompted the first officer to look at ADF1, which would be the NDB needle showing descent line tracking, and also to promptly follow the controller's instruction. These were all signs that the first officer might be acting a bit slow in the captain's opinion. He also prompted him on speed, trying to reduce it back to 150 knots. As the aircraft passed 4.5 miles, the air traffic controller started with her continuous transmission, designed to guide the aircraft down towards the runway. From this point onwards, there was not much more discussions at all between the two pilots, but what instead happened was that initially the aircraft started descending according to the 3 degrees path, but from around 4 miles, the rate of descent suddenly increased to about 1450 feet per minute, causing the aircraft to descend significantly below the intended path. Around this point is also where flaps 30 was most likely selected, which might have meant that the captain was busy completing the landing checklist and didn't monitor the descent rate too closely. As the aircraft entered the top of the fog bank at around 500 feet, the rate of descent was decreased back to around 750 feet per minute, which was almost exactly what a normal descent should be following a 3 degrees glide slope. But they were now significantly lower than they should be. There were no prompts heard from the captain who was pilot monitoring, possibly because he was now trying to peer out through the window and to see if he could see the runway through the clouds. The altitude messages from the controller had no meaning to the pilots at this point, since they were so far below them. It was likely just a distraction. If the idea from the crew was to try a dive and drive approach, well, then they would have needed to level off the aircraft at the decision height, but this height was never called out by the captain. During the steeper part of the approach, the aircraft's speed, indicated on the radar, had increased to around 175 knots, and with a tailwind of around 10 knots that was present at the time, this meant that the indicated airspeed must have been around 165 knots, also far above what they should have had at that point. The aircraft was no longer stabilized, but no one seemed to notice that. As the aircraft passed about 1.9 miles from touchdown, the descent rate again increased for some unknown reason, and the aircraft descended below 20 knots. The controller continued to give radar instructions. Remember, she could not see the aircraft height, only its position on the center line, and just after the aircraft had passed 1.8 miles at time 0952, the power suddenly went out all over the airport. Within 10 seconds, the backup generators had gotten the radio back online, but the radar took a bit longer to boot up. Meanwhile, the controller called the aircraft up to check if they had a runway in sight, but there was only silence on the frequency. A call was then placed to an RVR observer who had been standing close to the threshold for runway 23, and he reported that he had heard the sound of jet engines followed by a large bang. What had actually happened was that the aircraft had descended so low that it had impacted an 86 feet high power pylon situated on the extended descent line at a distance of around 1.1 miles. This collision was what had actually caused the power outage on the airport. The aircraft impacted the tower in almost level flight, mainly with the left wing, and the impact ripped off several of the leading and trailing edge flaps, as well as causing severe damage to the left engine. Since the flaps suddenly disappeared together with the thrust from the left engine, the sudden loss of lift and asymmetric power led to an uncontrollable left roll. When the aircraft was at an almost wings vertical attitude, the left wing then slammed into the gable of a nearby house, which ripped off the left wingtip. The aircraft then continued its left roll until it was almost inverted before it crashed into a woodland just a small distance away from a large housing area. After the crash, the aircraft burst into flames and the forward and center part were almost instantly consumed by the fire. All 5 people on board were killed in the crash, but miraculously no one else on the ground was hurt. The investigation immediately started, and unfortunately the flight data recorder was found to be inoperative. There had been problems with it earlier on and it had been replaced, but it seems like the new recorder also started malfunctioning pretty quickly. The cockpit voice recorder was found to be working, but due to the noise level in the cockpit and the continuous radio transmission during the last part of the approach, it was very hard to get a proper reading from it. In any case, the investigation quickly found that the last S.i.R approach had been flown significantly below the intended path, and that there didn't seem to be much discussions or height checks going on in the cockpit. The captain, who was pilot monitoring, had missed to call out the decision height when it was reached, possibly because of the lack of altitude bugs or because he was just looking outside searching for the runway at that point. The ground proximity warning system was a reactive type that built on the radar altimeters, and because the aircraft was in a landing configuration and with quite modest descent rate, none of its activation thresholds had been met, so it never sounded. The cause of the accident was found to be a controlled flight into the terrain during approach, likely caused by fatigued pilots operating their 5th sector after over 10 hours of night duty and after having flown 6 approaches. Standard operating procedures, call-outs and stabilize criteria had not been observed during the fatal approach. The recommendations included changes to the phraseology used by ATC during S.i.R approaches, including notifications of the minima to be used, as well as better and more prominent S.i.R charts. The UK approach ban rule needed to be emphasized to foreign operators to make sure that the pilots of those airlines were aware of it, and it should also be mandatory for air traffic control to report the latest weather to approaching aircraft, or at least confirm that they have the latest ATIS at first contact. This is why you pilots out there always hear UK approach controllers ask for this when you call them up nowadays. Air Algérie was recommended to implement mandatory CRM courses for all of their crews, as well as implement a safety management system to more accurately track potentially dangerous trends inside of the airline. Now, I personally feel like this is an excellent example of the threat fatigue can cause and how easy it is to fall into the get-there-itis instead of just taking the safe but sometimes really laborious option. Crucially, if you're a new pilot out there and you're watching this, then make sure that you get proper rest before any duty you have. And if you feel impaired in any type of way, speak up. Now, check out any of these videos next, and please consider joining my awesome Patreon crew using the links in the description below, or you can also support my work by buying a t-shirt, or if you feel like you need help with your fear of flying, then check out my new app.mentorpilot.com. It's awesome. Have an absolutely fantastic day. See you next time. Bye-bye.
So far this year, Boeing has had to deal with at least 2 separate issues affecting their Boeing 737 MAX production.
Once again, there is an issue with a non-conforming part.
So, what is actually going on? And more importantly, are there safety concerns? Well, today I will really dive into these issues, Boeing's recent history, and also some potentially worrying signs for their future. So, stay tuned. The Boeing 737 is Boeing's bread and butter aircraft. They make more 737s every month than all other aircraft types put together. And with Airbus now working hard to increase their production of the A320 family due to skyrocketing demand that they are feeling, Boeing is also looking to ways to increase their output. Since almost the very beginning of the 737's production, Boeing has been assembling them in their Renton facility, where they now have 3 final assembly lines, all pumping out aircraft at the moment. But because of the need to ramp up production, they are now also getting ready to start up a 4th production line, this time in Everett. Everett is located around 30 miles or 48 kilometers north of Renton in Washington state, and until now Boeing has only been making their wide bodies there. Now, starting this new assembly line is a huge deal. They're using the same factory space where the old 747 assembly lines used to be, and since they have also moved all of the 787 production down to South Carolina, they have plenty of space available. But sending all the necessary 737 parts from Renton to Everett is turning out to be a much bigger challenge than Boeing might have initially thought it would be. Most of these parts are relatively small and they're not necessarily made in Renton, but some of them are really big. Boeing, for example, makes the wings of the 737 in Renton, so now they would have to figure out a way to ship those ones up to Everett. Back in the day, there used to be a railway line linking the two sites together, but this line was unfortunately decommissioned decades ago. Large sections of that line have now been turned into nice walking and biking trails instead, so that's not going to be of much use for them. Other railway lines are of course available, but even if they manage to find a good workable connection, the need to package those huge wings for shipping is going to be something that Boeing has never really done before, so that's going to be a big challenge for them. And then we come to the fuselage of the 737, which is the part that involves both of the recent production problems that has been reported on. Now, the fuselage shipping already relies on rail to get up to Renton, but it's when it comes to the production of the fuselage that things start to get really interesting. And that's because Boeing doesn't actually make the 737 fuselages themselves. They used to do that, but since 2005 they have since instead been buying them from a subcontractor, and the fact that they have is actually one of the key differences between Boeing and Airbus today. You see, on the face of it, Airbus have also been spreading the production and assembly of their aircraft over several different sites, actually more sites than Boeing have, but Airbus own all of these manufacturing sites themselves, with a few minor exceptions. Boeing, on the other hand, have divested quite a lot of these sites to other companies, and there is a reason for that. Now, to be honest here, Airbus also tried to sell off some of their manufacturing sites, but then they eventually changed their mind, and we'll get back to why they did that later on. But this brings us to the subcontractor that is making the 737 fuselages, a company called Spirit Aerosystems, which is based in Wichita, Kansas. Now, Spirit isn't just a Boeing supplier for their 737s. They actually make structural parts for all Boeing jets, but the 737 is a special case. Spirit makes 70% of the 737 structure, including the entire fuselage, nose to tail, well, to the base of the tail to be exact. But the manufacturing plant in Wichita, which Spirit today calls home, actually has a very long history within Boeing. During the Second World War, Boeing Wichita, as it was known back then, was one of the places where Boeing assembled their B-29 bombers. And even after the war, Boeing continued making other large military planes there, including the B-47 and even the B-52. And if you want to go back even further than the Second World War, well, then this Wichita site was the base of Stearman Aircraft, who started their production as early as in 1927. They were then bought by Boeing in 1943, and the site was included in the purchase. So, if you're familiar with the wonderful Boeing Stearman biplanes, yes, that's exactly where they were made. In terms of airliners though, whether it was still Boeing Wichita or later Spirit Aerosystems, this site ended up producing parts for all Boeing aircraft, including the part that Boeing calls Section 41, which is the nose of the aircraft, including the cockpit. Obviously, like I said before, Spirit makes way more than that section for the 737, whose fuselage was always put together at this site. But even in the case of the 787, Spirit makes nearly the entire front half of the fuselage, as well as the cockpit and its subsystems. Today, Spirit employs over 11,000 people, and that's only at its Wichita site. Now, I'm going to get back into the reason why Boeing let go of its Wichita division, which led to the creation of Spirit a bit later in this video. But what it's worth keeping in mind here is that for all practical purposes, Boeing and Spirit are completely interlinked, and neither of them have any intention to change that. This means that Boeing has no plans to switch production of the 737's fuselage to another site, and with the 737 being key to the survival of both companies, any problems hitting it will have severe impacts for both of them. So, what is exactly going on with the MAX production? Well, I'll tell you all about that after this. If there's one thing that I am truly passionate about, it's teaching. Finding those tools who help light the flame of knowledge and excitement in someone's eyes is what any true instructor really lives for.
And that's why I am so happy to have Speakly as the sponsor for this video. You see, Speakly is exactly such a tool, but for the world of languages instead. They use a method which is focused on teaching words and sentences based on real-life situations, making it feel much more relevant and fun to learn, which it's really all about. I am currently using Speakly to improve my Spanish, y la verdad es que he aprendido un montón. Speakly's methods help you to learn a language up to 5 times faster than a traditional method does, which means that by practicing just 30 minutes per day, you can go from zero to solid speaking skills in as little as 3 to 4 months. The app is available on both iOS and Android, so if you are interested in learning a new language, you'll get a free 7-day trial by clicking on the link below. And if you then choose to sign up, the link will also give you an incredible 60% further discount. Muchas gracias, Speakly, y ahora seguimos con el video. Now, before I go any further, I want to really point out that the FAA has determined that neither of these two problems, which I'm about to explain to you, are safety of flight issues for the existing 737 fleet. But even though that is the case, they obviously still need to be addressed properly. The first problem involves the fitting of the vertical stabilizer, which is basically the vertical fin to the top rear of the fuselage, where there are 8 fittings between the two parts. A particularly eagle-eyed Spirit employee noticed that 2 of those 8 fittings on one of the 737 fuselages were manufactured and installed differently than what the specifications called for. After examining the problem, Spirit found that this sadly wasn't an isolated thing. It affected all 737 types currently in production, except for the MAX 9 and the upcoming MAX 10. This meant that the problem also affected the P-8 Alpha Poseidon, a military 737 which was based on the previous generation of 737-800s. The number of aircraft that are affected is still a little bit unclear, but the problem goes back as far as to 2019. Now, of course, production of the 737 was quite slow for some of that period because of the 737 MAX groundings, but still, this is a major headache. And unfortunately for both Spirit and Boeing, this is an expensive problem to fix. Spirit estimated that the cost of the repairs will go as high as to $100,000 to $150,000 per aircraft, and that meant that Spirit expected to spend $31 million on repairs of only the fuselages that they had on its hands right when they found out the problem. Now, later they reported that they had managed to complete the rework of those fuselages within their $31 million budget, but they also said that they expected a charge of $23 million extra, accounting for money that Boeing were likely going to charge them for repairs on affected aircraft that had already reached Boeing's own inventory. Remember, Boeing still have a lot of 737s that are awaiting delivery, many of them to airlines in China, and those planes obviously can't be delivered if they don't meet proper specifications, so they all must be fixed. The next problem also involves the rear of the 737 fuselage. This issue was revealed by the air current on the 23rd of August, and it has to do with snowmen. For anyone who uses machinery to drill holes, a snowman is a hole that you drill once. Then after you realize that it wasn't done properly, you drill a second hole a bit off to one side, and the result is a hole that looks kind of like a snowman. In practice, the 2 holes that were found in the aft part of the affected fuselages were very close to each other, so they were more of elongated holes than 2 distinct misaligned holes. But the issue here is that this problem involves the aft pressure bulkhead. As I'm sure most of you know, modern passenger aircraft are all pressurized, which means that the fuselages are exposed to quite a bit of internal stress. If you imagine that the fuselage of an airliner is a pressurized cylindrical canister, well then the aft pressure bulkhead is basically the part that is capping the end of that canister, and obviously it has a quite important role, so the building quality must be up to the very highest possible standard. After assembly of the aft pressure bulkhead, all of these elongated holes were covered with fasteners, in this case rivets, and this made it almost impossible to discover that problem in the first place. Boeing's engineers actually noticed it by observing inconsistencies around some of the affected rivet heads. More thorough inspections later found snowman holes that would have been impossible to see with the naked eye. And if we include these, the number of elongated holes go quite high up. In total, a 737 aft pressure bulkhead has around 4,000 holes, and in the affected aircraft, around 300 of those were found to be elongated. Again, the FAA did not classify this as a flight safety issue, but of course it needed to be fixed.
Initially, Boeing found 5 aircraft that had this issue, which were all MAX 8s and P-8 Poseidons. But Boeing is now also checking the rest of their inventory to find out if this was actually the full extent of the problem. And here are some both good and bad news. The good news is that inspecting fuselages, even on aircraft that are a little bit further along in their build, is relatively straightforward. Boeing are using X-ray equipment to do this, which works as long as there's good access to at least one side of the pressure bulkhead. But the bad news is that repairs are relatively difficult, especially for completed or mostly completed aircraft. And that's because on the cabin side of the aft pressure bulkhead, there are usually bits of galley equipment and even toilets, so all needs to be removed for this kind of work to be done. Now, when it comes to how this happens and how big of an effect this will have for Boeing's ongoing production, well, then there are some more good but a little bit strange news. Spirit has been using 3 different sources for the aft pressure bulkheads, 2 subcontractors plus their own in-house production. So, which one of these 3 do you think made the elongated holes? Yeah, the answer is Spirit themselves. Only the bulkheads that Spirit had produced in-house were made in a way that could cause these elongated holes to happen. And this is obviously something that both Spirit and Boeing are currently trying to get to the bottom of. But most importantly here, this means that Spirit can still continue delivering those fuselages to Boeing, but only those that have aft pressure bulkheads made by their 2 subcontractors. Of course, this issue can still potentially cause further delays as Boeing continue to inspect aircraft and potentially find more. But something that's worth keeping in mind here is that since Spirit are so closely tied to Boeing, all of the problems that Boeing have had to deal with in recent years has also affected Spirit, and maybe the key of the problem can be found in that relationship. Because like Boeing, Spirit had to survive the grounding of the 737 MAX, the halt in production of the 787 for even longer than that, and then of course the pandemic. In the years before that, well before the grounding of the 737 MAX, there were a lot of critics that argued that Boeing weren't properly sharing their profits with their suppliers, and that included Spirit, which was making them more vulnerable to crises like that. So that could potentially be the reason why Spirit are now having these problems, which are now coming back to bite Boeing in the ass. Because obviously, no matter if it's a subcontractor who have made these mistakes, Boeing are the ones who would have to answer for the problems, both to their customers and obviously also to their investors. For Spirit, these problems had a huge effect on their financial outlook, and they have also had to strike a new contract with their workforce back in July, which has drawn a lot of criticism. But this all raises a very obvious question, which I alluded to earlier. Why does Spirit even exist in the first place? Why did Boeing let go of its Wichita operations in 2005, and could Boeing absorb Spirit back into the company again since they obviously are so interlinked? Right, that's more than one question, but let's take them from the top. Boeing underwent quite a few changes after they acquired McDonnell Douglas back in the late 1990s. Probably the most visible of those was moving their headquarters from their manufacturing and engineering roots in Seattle down to Chicago. Now, the McDonnell Douglas merger really deserves its own video, which I will do in due time, but one change that it brought with it, which was much more important than that Chicago move, was the new management's decision to divest, basically to get rid of anything that they saw as non-core operations. The theory was that you could break down the operations or departments of a company and then study how well each of them were doing and of course how much money they were making. Then you should get rid of any operation or department that wasn't vital to the business or underperforming financially. Now obviously I'm oversimplifying this, but all of this is based on a popular financial metric called return on net assets, or RONA if you want to look it up. In this case, what Boeing's new McDonnell Douglas management decided was that Boeing mainly made their money by assembling aircraft and integrating their systems, not by making aircraft parts. Now, there are quite a few critics of this approach, even from people with a financial background, but right or wrong, this is why Boeing arranged the sale of its Wichita division back in 2005, along with several other manufacturing operations. Ironically, Boeing later had to buy back some of those operations, but its old Wichita division remained independent as Spirit Aerosystems. And Spirit didn't exactly sit still. The Spirit of today is far from the same company that they were back in 2005. From the beginning, the idea was that the Spirit would pursue other customers beside Boeing, trying to grow as an independent company, which kind of makes sense when you think of it. And this meant that less than a year after breaking loose, Spirit bought the aerostructures divisions of BAE Systems, which have sites both in England and Scotland. And the funny thing here was that this company's main customer was, you guessed it, Airbus. So today, Spirit Aerosystems Europe, as it's now called, makes structural parts for the Airbus A350, including composite fuselage sections. And on top of that, in 2019, Spirit acquired another aerostructures operation, this time in Belfast, Northern Ireland. This operation previously belonged to Bombardier in Canada, and they made the wings for the Bombardier C series, which we now know as the Airbus A220. Spirit also makes Airbus A220 engine pylons and previously got contracts to make key parts of the Gulfstream business jets, including wings, although they have since sold that operation. But to be fair to Boeing here, their argument was exactly that if Spirit divested from the main company, they would be able to chase customers and contracts that Boeing themselves wouldn't go for, and on that they were obviously completely on the money. Spirit are also involved in several military contracts, including with Northrop Grumman for their brand new B-21 stealth bomber and with Bell for the V-280 Army tilt-rotor aircraft, which are both really potentially lucrative contracts. But despite all of this, Boeing remains Spirit's main customers, accounting for 65% of their revenue in 2022. The 737 alone is responsible for 58% of Spirit's work, and to put that into perspective, Airbus accounted for 27% of Spirit's revenue during the same period. But because of this global involvement, a re-merger between Spirit and Boeing would be, well, complicated to say the least, even if that deal wouldn't include Spirit's Airbus operation. By now, many critics and even people within Boeing themselves agree that getting rid of Spirit was probably the single biggest mistake that Boeing ever made. And of course, Boeing's own finances right now mean that realistically, they just can't even afford to buy Spirit, even if they wanted to. So in June, Boeing's CEO confirmed that an acquisition of Spirit was not going to happen. To fix their current finances, both of these two companies are now effectively locked into doing what they do best, which is to make more 737s. About a month after the problem with the vertical stabilizer fittings appeared, Spirit restarted deliveries of their reworked 737, so they're working hard on it. That first problem caused delivery delays for 40 to 50 737s, and that happened at a time when rebounding travel demand and pressure to compete with Airbus production increases made that delay really painful. This is actually where Airbus showed that keeping fabrication work in-house makes ramping up production less complicated, and that's likely why they decided to stop trying to divest their supply line earlier on. Despite all of these hurdles though, if everything goes well and no new issues are found, Boeing could restart deliveries of the 737 to airlines in China as early as in late September, something that they haven't done since 2019, and that would be a huge deal for them. But in the longer term, if Boeing wants to really boost their production high enough to really chase Airbus, building extra assembly lines as we saw in the beginning is only part of the equation. Another part is looking after their suppliers and paying them well, and that goes especially for those that are so intimately linked with Boeing's own success. Now, John Ostrower in the Air Current have made a real deep dive into these issues and their causes and implications, so if you want to find out more about that, I highly recommend to check out the Air Current. Now, check out this video next, which I think that you'll find really interesting, and if you want to support my work, then consider sending a super thanks, buying some awesome merch, or joining my awesome Patreon crew. I just had another hangout with them last week, and it was great. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Weapon systems have almost always relied on kinetic energy to destroy their targets. From arrows and bullets to electromagnetic railguns that have a muzzle velocity of 9,800 feet per second, military engineers have been designing their weapons to throw one object at very high speeds in order to destroy other objects. However, new and disruptive battlefield technologies like inexpensive drones and hypersonic missiles have shifted the balance and cost effectiveness of traditional missile defense systems. And this has forced military engineers to investigate an existing, yet misunderstood weapon: lasers. Across air, sea, and land, this futuristic weapon is being developed, tested, and even used operationally. Lasers are being weaponized everywhere, from replacing Israel's Iron Dome system to protecting commercial cargo planes. But why early laser weapon systems failed and what helped them make a comeback. How this technology could save the military over $100,000 every single time it fires on a target. And how lasers not only can drop drones out of the sky, but they can also keep them flying with the help of fish is not what you think. One of the primary lessons learned from the war in Ukraine is the rising importance of unmanned weaponized systems. Drones have completely changed the dynamics of war in the air, on land, and at sea. They also cost very little. DJI Mavic, the drone that has reshaped the war in Ukraine, costs around $2,000 apiece. And by attaching explosives to them, these drones have become an inexpensive way to destroy multi-million-dollar tanks. There are of course existing ways to counter these pesky drones. Classic anti-air defense systems rely on precision missile strikes. But launching these weapons can be very expensive. For example, the cheapest of these systems is known as manpads. They only need one person to launch and usually use Stinger missiles. However, one Stinger missile costs an average of $100,000. Not to mention the larger systems in areas where Stingers aren't available, like the Patriot missiles, which cost on average a staggering $3 million per unit. So how can militaries fix this price asymmetry to avoid spending $3 million to take down a $2,000 drone? Engineers have spent the past years inventing solutions to this problem, like anti-drone nets and radio frequency drone blasters. But none have been as practical in addition to military's layered defense system as lasers. The main goal of using laser systems is improving a nation's layered or integrated defense strategy. Integrated defense is the use of layered systems of radars, ground and sea-based missile defense systems, and fighter jets, with the main goal of deterring traditional targets. Counter-rocket, artillery, and CRAM can also address asymmetric aerial attacks. A system with more layers can respond to a higher variety of threats. However, the new low, slow, and small threats like quadcopter drones can poke a hole in a nation's layered defense system. Cost is an important factor in layered defense systems, and lasers are a powerful solution to this problem. For example, a naval CRAM unit like this one fires 4,500 rounds per minute. It fires multi-purpose tracer high-explosive rounds, each costing around $27. So this burst of 3.43 seconds would cost $6,978. In comparison, that same burst from a 250 kilowatt high-energy laser would cost less than 25 cents. As an added bonus, you never have to reload. Lasers also add effectiveness to a layered defense system. They are more precise, require less logistical support, and reduce risk of collateral damage. But where are weaponized lasers being used today? Laser weapon systems are also known as direct energy weapons. Their first ever use was credited to Archimedes, all the way back in 212 BC, when he used mirrors with an adjustable focal point to redirect sunlight onto invading Roman ships and set them on fire. Lasers reappeared during President Reagan's era with the proposal of the Star Wars program. This aimed to use orbiting laser-equipped satellites to intercept Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the technology wasn't ready at the time, and the plan never took off. More recently, the US Congress has identified direct energy weapons as technology that could have a significant impact on US national security in the years to come. The US, as well as a handful of other nations including Germany, France, the UK, Israel, Russia, and China, have been testing these weapon systems for the past decade and are integrating them into their land, sea, and air capabilities. But how have these systems evolved to what we see today? Early versions of laser weapon systems are known as chemical lasers, since they obtained their energy from a chemical reaction. These were some of the most powerful laser systems available, but took up a lot of space. The YAL-1 was one of these systems. Fully operational in 2010, it was a large chemical laser mounted on the nose of a Boeing 747, capable of taking out missiles with its beam. However, the system took up the airplane's entire cargo bay and cost over $2 billion, which is why it was judged impractical and unaffordable and was discontinued in 2011. Some military and even civilian and cargo planes were fitted with similar, less powerful electric lasers called directed infrared countermeasures. This method uses a laser not to directly destroy an incoming missile, but to confuse its guidance system. By pulsing the laser, the missile loses track of its target, leading it off course. This process requires a pod setup, which is usually mounted under the fuselage. A missile warning system detects the missile, directs a turret with an infrared camera, and once the missile is tracked, the laser fires, disrupting the missile. Today, electric lasers have taken center stage thanks to advancements in the technology. These systems are far more compact and scalable compared to chemical lasers. In other words, their power output can go much higher without needing their size to increase, and they are called HELL, high-energy lasers. On land, these systems are being developed by military contractors like Raytheon for protection against short-range aerial threats like rams, and also new and dangerous LSS targets like swarms of drones. These systems are modular and can generate up to 50 kilowatts of power, melting polymer plastic drones in seconds. At sea, the Compact Laser Weapon Systems, or CLAWS, has been fitted onto American naval ships since 2014. Their power output is classified, but is estimated to be anywhere from 50 kilowatts to somewhere in the megawatts, and its range far outshines Raytheon's modular HELL. Operating both of these laser systems is incredibly easy to learn, using Xbox-like controllers to aim, lock, and fire at targets. Although they cost over 5 times the price of traditional counter-ram units, the long-term spending on these systems will decrease over time. They may be far more technologically advanced and therefore harder to manufacture, but having much less moving parts and no physical ammunition means much lower logistical costs and much more accurate shots. But lasers aren't only used to kill drones, they're also used to train them, using fish. Fish swim in schools, which are large groups that come together to form a sort of cloud, or you could even call it a swarm. Here, lasers are used to track and stimulate certain fish to see how a change in behavior in some of them leads to a change in behavior in the whole group. Scientists then measure these changes and create AI models based on this behavior to train drone swarms to move more like a group of living animals. This allows them to navigate new or unknown areas using only the movement of the larger group and without needing a full knowledge of the area. The fish basically teach drones how to be more independent. But this research is still in early stages. So how do swarm of drones today know how to navigate autonomously? That answer also lies in lasers, 3D mapping lasers. 3D laser mapping has recently been used to scan entire ships. DARPA is using the same tech to scan large buildings and entire urban environments to train drone swarms to navigate them with the help of machine learning. This program is called Offset. It starts by mapping an area to create a digital version of it. Those 3D LiDAR scanners take up to 1 million photos per second, creating a very precise virtual landscape. Human swarm commanders then use VR headsets to view environments and control simulated drones to set a mission plan. Then, the drones get to work, using a mix of AI-driven swarm tactics and human command. The offset system shows advanced swarm behavior inspired by nature, like collective decision-making, adaptive formation flying, and self-healing. Drone operations are limited by how much charge their battery holds. Of course, drones can find their way back to a charging station, where they can recharge and are then brought back to the surface to fly again. But thanks to lasers, drones could soon charge up while underway, without ever having to return to a charging station. Power beaming consists of a laser shining light onto a photovoltaic receiver that is tuned to the wavelengths of lasers. These receivers can achieve 1.5 to 2.5 times greater efficiency when using laser light compared to sunlight. Engineers at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory have been testing this technology since 2017. This project initially started by delivering energy to submarine drones through optical cables, but soon evolved to open-air power transfers. The system was able to deliver over 400 watts of power indoors to a receiver over 1,000 feet away. Although this may not seem like much, it proved the system to be safe and scalable. Finally, they were able to do an outside test with a receiver that was small and light enough to be placed on a UAV. This method of transferring energy without having to move mass is revolutionary. For example, it would reduce the infrastructure needed when setting up forward operation bases, as traditional wiring and fuel transfer mechanisms would become obsolete. Power beaming is portable, silent, and invisible, and allows for power transfers to areas that are traditionally inaccessible. These elements make it ideal for military operations. But where would all this power come from? The issue is that light travels in a straight line, so this technology's main limitation is line of sight. But what if that was no longer a problem, and we could beam power anywhere on Earth? A new project from the Air Force Research Laboratory called the Space Solar Power Incremental Demonstration and Research Project, or SPIDER, could do exactly this from orbit. This project aims to use satellites to collect energy from the sun and beam that energy down directly to receivers on Earth. This could further eliminate the need for power infrastructure, making local power generators and fuel convoys obsolete. The cherry on top is that this technology could also be used for civilian infrastructures around the world. But what happens when that beam hits the wrong area? Well, your guess is as good as mine.
All I needed was one big break, one huge, game-changing theory to win me back the love of my life. That's when she walked in. You can tell just by looking at her that this was a girl with secrets to hide.
Are you the theorist?
Clearly, she had not read the sign on my door. Or maybe she was just playing dumb. There was no way to tell.
Well, are you? I mean, you're just kind of staring at me, muttering under your breath.
Sorry, got caught up in monologuing. Yeah, that's me. You looking for a theory?
There's been a murder, and I need you to solve it.
Great. We talking sonic, demonic, animatronic?
Pocket.
Hello, Internet! Welcome to Style Theory, the channel that serves you beauty and brains. If you're here, then congratulations, you are part of history. You are one of the first people to not only see this episode, but also the final channel to complete the great theorist wheel. Game, film, food, and now style. Four kingdoms living together in harmony like Avatar. You know what's even cooler than watching a single video though? Being one of the first to subscribe to that new channel. Claim it, because then you could say you've been here since day one. Also, while you're down there doing me a favor, let me run a quick poll. Hit the like button if you've never had to think about the size of your pockets. If you just hit that like button, then you are a lucky person, and also probably a dude. You see, when I first pitched the idea of dedicating our next channel to style and fashion, all the female members of Team Theorist jumped up and insisted that we do an episode about the size of women's pockets. They insisted that women's pockets are not only smaller than men's, but are in fact so small that they've become completely useless. At the time, I didn't really get what the big deal was. But loyal theorists, now that I've done the research, I can tell you that this conspiracy goes deep, unlike women's pockets. You see, the systemic murder of women's pockets is simultaneously a mystery and a cover-up. A conspiracy to hide the truth behind flashy trends and pretty faces, all while the big guys in their shadowy rooms with their even bigger pockets figurative pockets this time, pull the strings behind runway curtains. So, who stands to win big when women are losing precious inches of personal storage freedom? Before we can break down our suspects, we need to understand where this pocket problem first started. The first record of anything relating to a pocket dates back to Otzi, also known as the Iceman, Europe's oldest natural mummy from around 3350 to 3105 BC. His body was found preserved wearing a belt with an attached pouch, making him one of, if not the, oldest example of what I personally call ye oldie fanny pack. And while Otzi was the first, he definitely wasn't the last. This type of belt-pouch combo was typical for centuries around the world. In Japan, you saw pouches attached to sashes around the waist. In Europe, this style developed into what's commonly referred to as tie-on pockets. Even in the New World, decorative bags were very common amongst the indigenous Americans. And boy, did these babies hold a lot. Stand aside their cargo pants, you can't hold a candle to the amount of candles I'm stuffing into these bad boys. Because of how functional they were, these tie-on bags were worn by both men and women at the time. There was just one problem. Loosely tied, hanging bags make it way too easy for pickpockets to run away with all your belongings. In fact, the Old Bailey criminal database, which tracks old London crimes, has an absolutely staggering 113 pages of search results for just pickpocketing alone. And mind you, these are the people who were caught. Have to leave the house, pack your pockets, and prepare for crime. Clearly, there needed to be a better solution. So what's the answer to all this petty pocket thievery? Inside pockets. Pockets started to migrate into and under your clothing. And this, loyal theorists, is where the great pocket divide begins. Depending on your source, the late 1600s to early 1700s is generally considered the breaking point for pocket equality. Men's pockets moved into their clothes, being sewn into their pants, coats, and pretty much wherever. Women, however, were left to tie their pockets to their waists with two options: either above their outfits for easy reach, or under their petticoats for privacy, but with little access to their personal effects. If you went with the under the petticoat option, you were either lucky enough to have a slit built into your skirt in order to get to your things, or you were left searching for a place to strip down to your skivvies just to reach your keys. But why? Why would fashion diverge like this? Who's responsible? Send in the suspects, boys. 3 suspects, 3 potential pocket perps. Let's look at them one at a time, shall we? Suspect number 1, style. The trends. The fashion darling. Were pockets simply too last century for the modern-day stylish woman? Well, around the late 18th century, the French Revolution caused a wave of changes to clothes of all kinds, as what you wore suddenly was seen as a political statement. The large, voluminous skirts that used to be popular were associated with the old regime, and thus quickly went out of fashion. I wonder why you wouldn't want to be associated with the old regime during the French Revolution. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Nothing like the risk of being beheaded to get you to refresh your wardrobe. Waistlines raised, skirts and dresses slimmed down, and in the midst of all this evolution, women's pockets had nowhere to go. Men's pockets, however, were doing just fine. Despite men's fashion also settling into a sleeker style during this period, pockets were deemed a necessity for their clothes. And somehow they found a way to be both flattering and functional. Go figure, it can be done if you just try. Even these pants, which, are these even pants? Well, even these quote-unquote pants have themselves a pocket built in for the men, but not the women. Why the double standard? Bulges. Nope, not like that. Well, actually, yeah, kind of like that. You see, it was considered unattractive to break up the clean lines of a woman's dress. It was also a sign of status to have nothing to carry, as women didn't own property or have their own money. Their husbands did. Well, there were still some tie-on pockets working with the higher waistline, and some small pockets only large enough to fit a handkerchief. Women needed to find other means of carrying their stuff. And that fashion trend has largely persisted since. Let's look at everyone's favorite staple, skinny jeans. Back in the early 2000s, you could not escape these bad boys. And I mean it, you literally could not escape them. Have you ever tried peeling yourself out of a pair of extra tight skinny jeans at the end of a long day? It's like skinning a sausage. But enough about my past traumas, let's go back to pockets. Men's skinny jeans have themselves deep functional pockets, while women can barely fit half their hand in, let alone most phones these days. When the iPhone 6 was announced, people wrote multiple articles about whether or not the phone would be able to fit in the pockets of women's clothing. In fact, this study showed that women's pockets are on average 48% shorter and 6.5% narrower than the respective men's pockets. Might not seem like a lot, but size starts to matter real fast once you start talking about fits. Speaking of your looks, you want to know an amazing accessory that'll never ruin your silhouette and fit into a pocket of any size? A subscription to this channel. It goes with any outfit and will never go out of style. Plus, you can help support a brand new channel. Isn't that beautiful? So go ahead, click that subscribe button so you can be notified of all our newest, weirdest theories. Did you know that spray-on dresses are a thing nowadays? It is like one of the wildest things I've ever seen, and it truly represents the future of fashion. That theory is coming up in the next couple of weeks, so if you want to check check it out. That subscribe button is gonna help you do that. In the meantime, though, let's get back to the pocket, shall we? With all this talk about carrying things, it's time to look at suspect number 2 for who potentially killed pockets, the purse industry. Whether you call it a purse, a pocketbook, or a handbag, it all leads back to the same thing, money. If you can't carry something in your pocket, you have to put it somewhere else. And that's exactly what happened. When pockets started to go out of fashion in popular society, what entered the scene was a little item called the reticule. And I do mean little item. Look at this thing, it's so teeny. I suppose you could say that it's so small, it's ridiculous. Am I right? I am so sorry, I am so ashamed of my actions. These small decorative bags could barely fit, well, anything. Women went from being able to carry a lot with little effort to having everything shrink to fit the meager space of a glorified coin purse. If they didn't mind having their items on display for everyone to see, they could always utilize a chatelaine, a decorative waist chain that leaves nothing to the imagination. According to this illustration from 1849, it was the best present for ladies of the time due to its multiple uses. I guess I know what I'm getting Steph and Ollie for Christmas this year. From their first big introduction, bags only became more and more of a mainstay in a woman's wardrobe. Fashion houses quickly took to the idea, with Louis Vuitton giving bags structure, size, and more durability. This new handbag spoke to a need in the market, a need for independence that had been lost when the large pockets of the past first disappeared. But with new options and a whole new market opened up, who needed pockets? Now, you could get a woman to pay for an outfit and the accompanying bag to hold her things. Sure, it was a necessity, but it was also a fashion statement and a symbol of status. The style, brand name, and size of the bag would tell someone everything you wanted them to know about you. Remember the reticule? It was decorative, fancy. It was designed to show off. You weren't working class lugging around a bunch of heavy things. You had like a Tic Tac in there or something. You didn't need to get your hands dirty. A bag meant that you were someone of value. But once everyone has themselves a bag, how do you differentiate yourself? Well, with bigger brands and higher price tags. In 2021, the global handbag market's valued at $49 billion and growing. People now buy handbags as investment pieces, choosing to invest their money in the handbag stock market over Wall Street. I'm not even joking about that. Why invest in GameStop when you can have yourself a $1.9 million Birkin bag? In the first 9 months of 2022 alone, LVMH, the corporation behind brands like Louis Vuitton, Christian Dior, and Fendi, earned around $60 billion in the US, with nearly half of that being from fashion and leather goods. The world's most expensive handbag is currently valued at $3.8 million. We are talking about some Scrooge McDuckian levels of money all wrapped up in a fancy designer bag. If that ain't motive to keep women's pockets shallow, I don't know what is. And since we're on the topic of motive, it's time to reveal suspect number 3, the man, the Brojack Horsemans of the world. Now, before anyone starts a flame war down in the comments, this isn't coming from me. This is coming from historical documentation written by people far smarter than me. You see, it's hard to talk about pockets without also mentioning our favorite frenemy, politics. It's always there, lurking in the background like some kind of certified creeper. And politics are everywhere when it comes to fashion. Let's lay out the case, shall we? If we rewind back to the late 18th century, when style was shifting to slim silhouettes, politics was there whispering in its ear. If women had the space to carry so much, what else could they carry? Money, secrets, independence? And that's not an exaggeration here either. Criminal reports from this era listed women using their pockets to do everything from shoplifting to stealing neighborhood ducks to plotting the assassination of major political figures. No joke, Cécile Renaud, a royalist, was executed for attempting to kill Maximilien Robespierre, a key figure during the French Revolution, using a set of penknives that she hid in her, you guessed it, pockets. And so suddenly there was a strong political motivation for the key decision makers to make pockets go the way of the dinosaurs and super low-rise jeans. Suddenly, pockets became a symbol of revolution. In the 1800s, an organization called the Rational Dress Society attempted to protest against the current fashions they viewed as constricting and impractical. They and other members of the Victorian dress reform movement wanted their clothes to reflect the freedom that they wanted. Their main points of order focused mainly on the popular corsets and skirts of the time, opting to push for looser styles, boneless stays, and most importantly of all, pants. Bicycle costumes and bloomer suits suddenly gave women pockets for resting their hands and pistols in. Seriously, they were called pistol pockets, special pockets lined with duck or leather to contain and conceal small firearms. While that might not have hit mainstream, it did open a door for the future. The suffragette movement and the world wars sparked another wave of pocket rebellion. With the men off at war, masculine fashions became the norm for working women. The suffragette suit was a multi-pocket slap to the face of societal expectation and had one of the more fun historical fashions known best as secret pants. Pants that give the illusion of wearing a long skirt while allowing you the freedom of movement and storage of pants. In short, pants and their respective pockets meant rebellion. And to politics, nothing is scarier than something that breaks the mold. But when the wars were over, women were expected to fall back and hand over their pants and pockets to their husbands. Except they suddenly realized how fun and nice and useful all of those things were. So there you have it, my friends, 3 suspects. And as you might have figured out, the murder of Pockets wasn't just a one-man job. It was a group effort. All 3 forces working together to do the deed. So after almost 200 years of pocket wars, where do we stand? Fake and shallow pockets still plague women's clothing. Is it inevitable that pockets remain a luxury just for men? Well, it doesn't have to be that way. Honestly, it's up to you, the buyer. Your money is what's going to shape the future of pockets. Capitalism, am I right? Much like the suffragettes with their suits, modern women's fashion is working to take back pockets, with smaller fashion brands taking a stand and inserting portable personal storage into their outfits. Having pockets has now become a main selling feature for women's dresses, and fitting fully functional storage into stylish silhouettes is how up-and-coming designers are making a name for themselves. It's a revolution using the weapon companies fear the most, not pistol pockets, the almighty dollar. If you buy it and show the fashion industry that you demand equal pockets, they're gonna have to listen, or else they're gonna watch as their bank account shrinks to the size of a skinny jeans pocket, a women's skinny jean pocket. And listen, I'm not here to tell you what to wear. I fully believe fashion is one of the biggest ways to express yourself. Whether you prefer a bodycon dress or an oversized tee, whether you love to collect designer bags or make your partner carry all your stuff, fashion is freedom, and people deserve to be able to choose pockets, no matter their gender. So the next time you compliment a woman's outfit and they happily exclaim, "Thanks, it has pockets," celebrate with them, knowing just how long it took them to get there. And that, my friends, is the power of a pocket. But hey, that's just a theory. A style theory. Keep looking sharp. By the way, if you think pockets are the only interesting thing about a pair of pants, then you need to check out our other new episode that we just uploaded, breaking down what the Hulk's pants would really be made of to survive his supersized transformation. Spoiler alert, it's not spandex, and what they're made out of is gonna be real expensive. That video's on screen right now. Go click it. It is binge watch day, baby. We got ourselves a new channel, and we got 5 videos to celebrate all at the same time. So go watch them all. Complete the watch circle.
Most 3D character-driven video games can be pretty easily placed into one of 2 categories, either first-person or third-person. In a first-person game, you see the game world through the actual eyes of the player character as though you were that character, and in a third-person game, you see the player character from the outside, often from behind their back or from a fixed isometric perspective. But the existence of these 2 perspectives begs a question. If this is what a first-person game looks like, and this is what a third-person video game looks like, what exactly would second-person look like? Now, I'm not the first person to wonder about this. The question of whether or not a second-person shooter could actually exist is one that has plagued video game message boards just about as long as the internet has existed. It's also served as the premise for some pretty good comedy sketches over the years, like this one from Mega64.
Introducing the world's first second-person shooter.
And this one from The Onion.
To enter second-person shooter mode, you just simply adjust the narrative slider from first to second.
You are walking down a long corridor. Suddenly, a Nazi leaps out from around a doorway and unleashes a hail of machine gun fire in your direction.
But to help us actually figure out what a second-person game would really be, I think it would be helpful to look at this grammatically. In written language, the term first person denotes any writing where the point of view uses phrases like I or my to tell a story from the perspective of the protagonist. Third person writing, on the other hand, uses third person pronouns, for example, he went this way, she went that way, etc., to talk about characters from an outside perspective. Now, second person writing does exist, but it's kind of a weird one. In second person, the primary pronoun used is you. You do this, you go there, etc. The second person is actually a lot less common in narrative writing, and is actually something you're more likely to encounter in, say, a list of instructions or a choose-your-own-adventure book. Now, the analogous video game camera perspectives for first and third person writing are obvious, but what about for second person? We know what an I game looks like, and we know what a he game looks like, but what about a you game? Strangely enough, I actually found the answer to this before I even came up with a question, and believe it or not, it came to me courtesy of a game you may have heard me talk about once before, and that game is Driver San Francisco. See, for all the interesting missions in Driver San Francisco, and there are plenty of them, there's one mission in particular that I swear to God I think about all the time. The mission in question is called The Target, and it's the final mission of Chapter 6 of the game. In the game, you play as a cop named John Tanner, who, for reasons I won't get into here, basically has a superpower that allows you to take over the bodies of any other driver, and has begun using that superpower to foil a possible terror plot from a gangster named Jericho. Over the course of the game, Tanner decides that the best way to unravel Jericho's plans is to do it from the inside, and in order to do that, Tanner takes over the body of a low-level henchman named Ordell and uses his driving skills to help move Ordell up the ranks. The final mission in this story arc sees you inhabiting Ordell's body one last time to complete a major assignment from his boss Layla, who is this international assassin and Jericho's second-in-command. Tanner's plan? Warp into Ordell's body and, without arousing suspicion, drive Layla and Ordell directly into police custody. Now the mission begins as normal with Tanner and his partner Jones driving their iconic orange Dodge Challenger, and soon enough you warp into Ordell's body with Layla in the passenger seat where she gives you some clarity on your mission.
Ordell, I need nothing but your best today.
What's going down?
Jericho's got a problem he wants fixed. Get me to the target and I'll fix it.
So you drive to the destination she's given you, closing in on your target, and as you get close, this happens.
Slow down. We should acquire the target anytime now. The yellow Dodge, up ahead. Stay close, but don't be obvious.
That's my car.
What? That's the cop that's been getting in our way.
Do we follow him to the target?
He is the target.
It's you. You've been assigned to kill you. Now, after that cutscene ends, you are back in Ordell's body in the first person with Layla sitting to your right. But then, you press the throttle to accelerate, and the car in front of you moves. You steer to the left and to the right, and the car in front of you moves to the left and then to the right. And then quickly, it sinks in that the car you're controlling is actually the car you're following. Your perspective as the player is entirely separate from what you're controlling as the player. In other words, you're pursuing you. Now, as you can see, the car that you're sitting in is moving too, but crucially, you're not the one who's controlling that car. The car you're sitting in is moving automatically, seemingly operated by an AI-controlled driver who's tailing the car you're actually controlling. It's basically like a chase mission in any other video game, just like you've seen countless other times, except for this time, it's flipped on its head. This time, you're the one being followed while simultaneously seeing it all unfold from the perspective of the car doing the following. And while it's hard for me to guess how well this comes across on video, all these elements combine to make something that is very, very odd to play. There's something shocking and disorienting about seeing a first-person perspective on your screen, but also not controlling that perspective while remotely operating the car that you're tailing. It's the closest a video game has ever gotten to feeling like a true out-of-body experience, and it's an experience that has stuck with me ever since I first played this game back in 2011. Now, when I first played Driver San Francisco 8 years ago, I kind of just played through this mission once, start to finish, marveling at the unique perspective that this mission granted you, but then moving on to the rest of the game. But I've always felt like if I ever came back to this game, I'd want to pick this mission apart and see what makes it tick, and that's part of what I hope to accomplish with this video. See, as cool as this mission is, it's also pretty linear. The whole thing takes place with you driving down this completely locked down race course with no exits or detours, pretty much just a straight shot to the exit. I've always assumed that the developer Reflections designed the mission this way due to the technological limitations of this weird second-person camera that they built just for this mission. Perhaps there was no way for them to get this camera to behave properly in the actual open world with all the various streets, elevations, and alleyways you could dip into, not to mention the other street traffic. And on top of that, they built this mission with a pretty strict countdown timer, forcing you to hit the checkpoints in rapid succession, something that I always assumed was placed there to keep you from ever veering too far off the path and breaking the game somehow. Still, I've always wondered about the actual limitations of this mission, and I knew that this time around I wanted to test out whether or not there was any way to escape. So before finishing the mission, I paused, started it over, and then this time, instead of starting the race as intended, I swung the car into a 180, driving the car backwards in the wrong direction. Now, when I do this, the AI driver immediately begins panicking, rapidly spinning the steering wheel, trying desperately to keep my car visible in frame, and then eventually it turns around 180 degrees to reveal what looks like the entire open world of Driver San Francisco, seemingly 100% accessible to the player. Now, I drove away from the racetrack and began exploring, and I kept bracing myself to hit some kind of invisible wall or failure state for going off course, but it never happened. It all actually worked. I merged into traffic and the second-person camera followed me, immaculately bobbing and weaving through the other cars on the road. It was around this time that I noticed there was no timer. It turns out that Reflections had generously designed this mission, intentionally or unintentionally, so that the mission countdown timer doesn't actually begin until you reach the first checkpoint, meaning that if you never hit that first checkpoint, you can drive around forever. This led to what I can only describe as a transcendent video game experience. It felt like I was seeing something that I was never meant to see. This ability to explore the city as much as I wanted to, all from this wholly unique, extremely surreal second-person viewpoint. It felt like a magical experience and one that almost nobody else has experienced for themselves. Now, revisiting this mission and managing to escape the confines laid down by the developers all those years ago, I really wanted to try and push this thing to its limits. I couldn't resist trying to break things a little. I drove the car off ramps, into oncoming traffic, all of it, but surprisingly, it held together perfectly. That is, until I tried one specific thing. See, I haven't talked about it before, but this mission actually does have a failure condition. In the lower right corner of the screen, there's a health meter, and it represents the health of Tanner's car, the car you're chasing/driving. But if you get into one too many collisions while driving this car in the second person, you can actually run out of health, causing Tanner to die and the mission to end in a loss. Now, this is actually pretty hard to achieve on the default mission path they laid out, but driving into oncoming lanes of traffic and ramping off car transporters had taken its toll on my vehicle, and I only had a small sliver of health left. Wanting to explore this mission as long as possible, I gingerly pulled Tanner's car into a narrow alleyway and then decided to try out the one thing I hadn't attempted yet. I turned around and drove the car in the second person directly at myself. This put the AI driver in a weird position. It now had to drive backwards just to keep me in the frame, and it was also narrowly sandwiched between the two walls of the alley, giving it almost no room to maneuver. I kept driving towards myself, putting on the pressure closer and closer, and then...
Nice work.
It broke. All at once, the second-person vehicle shoots into a wall, clips through it, and then launches hundreds of feet into the air. Briefly, one frame at a time, we can get glimpses of the chaos that unfolded. We see the car inside the wall, then we see the car's front console flipped over, we see what appears to be the ocean floor, and then the pavement as seen from underneath. We see rooftops, the driver's arm, the sky, trees, abstract geometry, and then the city from above, flooded with unloaded geometry. After that, we see the car spinning and spinning in midair, giving us glimpses of San Francisco from above, before finally getting so high that nothing can be seen but endless ocean. And then, black. Suddenly, all at once, the car snaps back to Earth. The health meter for Tanner's vehicle turns blindingly white, and then the second-person viewpoint fills with an orange-yellow hue, Tanner's car. Quickly, it becomes clear that the second-person car has somehow spawned inside of Tanner's vehicle, dealing infinite damage to the car. A deafening crash sound can be heard, and shattered glass flies everywhere, and then, for a brief moment, right before the mission ends, the camera inexplicably shifts into Tanner's car, where the car is balanced on its nose, its windshield shattered, thrust impossibly through another vehicle. And then, horrifically, the camera clips through the back of Tanner's partner's head and shows us the backside of his eyeballs and tongue. A truly terrifying second-person perspective if ever there was one. Shaken by my otherworldly encounter seemingly brought on by pushing this already existential mission to its limits, I reset the mission and played beginning to end one last time, this time careful to do it the right way, not wanting to disturb whatever eldritch being I'd upset by breaking the mission in the first place. After all, I thought, I know that every mission in Driver San Francisco ends with a continue and retry option, so if I really wanted to explore this mission again, I could always hit the retry button to give it another shot after running through it normally. So, I proceed to complete the mission as intended, a mission, by the way, that ends with the antagonist Jericho actually taking over your body and attempting to drive you into a lethal car accident.
You mean Jericho?
Sit back and enjoy the show. Not many people get to watch themselves die.
A problem that Tanner decides to solve by, disturbingly enough, shifting for the first and only time in the game into his partner Jones's body. Yes, that partner.
What the hell's going on?
Anyways, I go to finish the mission the normal way, staying on the path, fully expecting the restart option that appears after most missions to show up. Instead, I get to the end of the mission, and for some reason that I still can't explain, the only option was continue. The reset option had vanished. Panicked, I quickly hit Alt F4 and exited the game, hoping I could load up my save file and play through the mission again, but it was too late. It had already auto-saved over my file, and the mission was gone with no way to replay it again. Look, Driver San Francisco is a game full of weird, interesting, strikingly designed missions, but to me, the target has always stood out as the perfect example of what makes this game special. Video games are an entire medium built around taking over others' bodies, and Driver San Francisco is a richly existential and metatextual reflection of this idea. This mission in particular brought these ideas to the fore in a way that I wasn't fully prepared for and that I'm only now beginning to wrap my head around years and years later. Even writing the script for this video felt like a mind-bending exercise in trying to explain something that is borderline unexplainable. You really have to play it for yourself to get a full sense of how crazy this mission feels. In designing this mission, Reflections took decades of 3D video game conventions and turned them on their head to create what feels like a truly out-of-body experience. That, to me, is an accomplishment worth celebrating. Please play Driver San Francisco.
If you're here, who's in your body?
Well, no one. Oh, God.
Alright, so a couple quick updates on the Driver San Francisco situation. The petition to get Ubisoft to relist the game that I mentioned at the end of my last video is now at over 70,000 signatures, which is insane. Please, if you have any interest in this game, please sign this petition. It now feels like 100,000 is within our grasp, which is crazy, and I can't believe I'm saying, but it could happen, which to me feels like an unignorable number. But in the meantime, as you might have noticed, Ubisoft has not relisted the game. They have been ignoring the 70,000 signatures we have. And on a totally unrelated note, not connected at all, Driver San Francisco, since my video last month, has been in the top 10 most downloaded games on the Pirate Bay. Totally no relationship there, not mentioning that for any reason at all, just saying the game is not available, and it's also one of the most pirated video games, and has been in the top 10 most pirated games for the past month. Just a coincidence. Also, totally unrelated to the fact that this game is apparently very popular on Pirate Bay, did you know that if you go to nordvpn.org/Babylonian, you can go to websites, illicit or non-illicit, without being tracked by your ISP or anybody else? So that means that, for example, if you were to go to, and I'm not saying you should, a website that allowed you to download a video game that is no longer available and can be easily pirated with just a few clicks, and you don't want to get an angry email from your ISP saying you can't do that, you should invest in a VPN. If you go to nordvpn.org/Babylonian and use coupon code Babylonian to get 70% off their 3-year plan and get 1 full month of VPN coverage free. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please share it with anyone you think would like it, and or subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more stuff like this in the future. I've got a lot of videos in various stages of production right now that I'm really excited to get out into the world, and I can finally start thinking about them now that this one's done. So yeah, that's it from me for this time. Hopefully the next video comes out a little quicker. I got a lot of ideas that have nothing to do with Driver SF. This one has been on my mind for a while, and I'm glad to finally have it done. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.